Case number 1. Bradley Robert Edwards, the Claremont serial killings. Let's begin tonight's story in the quiet, affluent suburb of Claremont, Perth, in Western Australia. This is a case the police themselves would later describe as the state's biggest, longest-running, and most expensive investigation in its history. It's a story about 3 women who went out for a night in the same small strip of nightlife and never made it home. And it's a story that would take more than 2 decades to reach any kind of resolution. It all started on the night of the 27th of January, 1996. An 18-year-old woman named Sarah Spears had spent the evening at Club Bayview, right in the heart of Claremont. At around 2 in the morning, she left the club. 6 minutes later, at 2:06 a.m., she called Swan taxis from a public telephone booth. Here's where things get strange. Sarah was living in South Perth with her older sister at the time, but she asked to be taken not home, but to the nearby suburb of Mosman Park. 3 separate eyewitnesses would later say they saw her standing alone, waiting near the corner of Sterling Road and Sterling Highway. Those same witnesses also mentioned seeing an unidentified car stop right where she was standing. When the taxi she called finally arrived at 2:09 a.m., just 3 minutes after her call, Sarah was gone. She was never seen again. Her disappearance triggered massive publicity across the country, and to this day, her fate remains unknown. Just over 4 months later, in the early hours of Sunday the 9th of June, 1996, a second woman vanished from the very same part of Claremont. Her name was Jane Rimmer. She was 23 years old, from the suburb of Shenton Park. Like Sarah, she'd been out socializing with friends. That night, her group had moved between 3 venues, the Ocean Beach Hotel, then the Continental Hotel, and finally Club Bayview. When they saw the line at Club Bayview was too long, Jane's friends decided to catch a taxi home. Jane, though, chose to stay behind. The last anyone saw of her was security footage showing her waiting outside the Continental Hotel at 12:04 a.m. 55 days after she vanished, on Saturday the 3rd of August, 1996, a family out picking wildflowers stumbled across her naked body in bushland near Woolcote Road, in an area called Wellard, 40 kilometers south of Claremont. 9 months after that, in the early hours of Saturday the 15th of March, 1997, a 3rd woman disappeared. Her name was Sierra Glennon. She was 27 years old, a lawyer living in Mosman Park. Just like the others, she'd been out with friends at the Continental Hotel and decided to make her own way home rather than travel with the group. 3 men standing at a bus stop saw her walking south along Sterling Highway at around 12:30 a.m. They watched her interact with an unidentified light-colored vehicle that had pulled up beside her. 19 days later, on the 3rd of April, a bushwalker found her semi-clothed body 40 kilometers north of Claremont, near a track off Pippitany Road in Eglinton. Now, let's talk about how police responded. Within just 48 hours of Sarah Spears going missing, the case had already been handed to the Major Crime Squad. After Jane Rimmer disappeared, Western Australia police set up a dedicated task force. They called it Macro. It was headed first by an officer named Paul Ferguson and later by David Caporn. Once Sierra Glennon vanished too, police went public and confirmed they believed they were hunting a serial killer. The Western Australian government offered $250,000 in reward money. At that time, the largest reward the state had ever offered. Early on, investigators focused on unidentified vehicles that had been seen near 2 of the disappearance sites and on an unidentified man caught on video footage. Suspicion then turned toward Perth's taxi drivers, since all 3 women had last been seen in circumstances suggesting they may have used a cab. One driver even claimed he'd driven Sarah Spears the night before she vanished. This led to an enormous fingerprint and DNA testing operation across thousands of licensed taxi drivers in Western Australia. During that process, investigators discovered a number of unlicensed operators were working in the industry. As a result, the standard for taxi licensing were tightened, and 78 drivers with significant criminal histories were stripped of their licenses. Stricter rules were also introduced requiring decommissioned taxis to have their insignia and equipment removed. Years later, in December 2015, investigators revealed that fibers recovered from Jane Rimmer's body had been traced to a Holden Commodore vs. Series 1, the very same model car that had been seen near one of the crime scenes. The macro task force grew to more than 100 members spread across 10 teams at its peak. To prevent leaks to the media, strict confidentiality protocols were put in place, and details about the nature of the victims' injuries were kept suppressed. But the task force also drew criticism. One of its more controversial tactics involved sending questionnaires to 110 persons of interest, which included blunt, confrontational questions like, quote, "Are you the killer?" Investigators also brought in international experts and used an imported lie detector machine. In one bizarre episode, an officer even accepted an offer of help from David Birney. Yes, the same David Birney responsible for the Moorhouse murders you'll hear about later tonight. Perhaps most damaging to the investigation was its narrow, years-long focus under David Caporn on a man named Lance Williams, who remained the prime suspect for a very long time despite a lack of any direct evidence connecting him to crimes. Over its lifetime, the Macro Task Force underwent 11 separate police reviews, including one in August 2004 led by Paul Schramm, the same officer who led the investigation into the Snowtown murders. Macro was finally wound down in September 2005, and the case was handed over to the Special Crimes Squad. So who was Lance Williams? He was a 41-year-old public servant from Cotslow who was identified by police in April 1998 as the prime suspect. His behavior, things like driving around after midnight and circling the Claremont area as many as 30 times, had attracted attention during a decoy operation police were running. Williams was placed under a high level of surveillance and endured years of police pressure. He maintained his innocence throughout. After police had interviewed him 6 separate times at length, they finally declared in late 2008 that he was, quote, no longer a person of interest. Williams died in 2018. Other names were floated too. Police also looked into whether the so-called backpacker murderer, Bradley Murdoch, could have been involved, although Murdoch was actually serving a custodial sentence from November 1995 until February 1997, which would rule him out for at least part of the timeline. In October 2006, it was also announced that a British murderer named Mark Dixie had become a prime suspect, and that Macro had requested his DNA. But Western Australia Police Deputy Commissioner Murray Lampard later stated that Dixie had been closely investigated and eventually ruled out. The real breakthrough finally came on the 22nd of December, 2016, when a man named Bradley Robert Edwards was arrested at his home in Kewdale in connection with the deaths of Jane Rimmer and Sierra Glennon. He was charged the very next day. According to ABC News, Edwards had no previously known link to the case. He had, however, previously pleaded guilty to an aggravated assault on a social worker at Hollywood Private Hospital back in May of 1990. He was also charged in relation to 2 other attacks, a break-and-enter and unlawful detention of an 18-year-old woman in Huntingdale in February 1988, where a stolen kimono containing his DNA had been dropped as the attacker fled the scene, and the unlawful detention and 2 count of aggravated sexual penetration without consent of a 17-year-old girl in Claremont in February 1995. Then, on the 22nd of February, 2018, Edwards was further charged with a willful murder of Sarah Spears, the very first victim, even though her body has never been found. In total, Edwards faced 8 charges. On the 21st of October, 2019, he pleaded guilty to the 5 non-murder charges relating to the Huntingdale and Karrakatta Cemetery incidents. Before the murder trial began, prosecutors successfully applied for Edwards to be tried by a judge alone, without a jury, due to the intense publicity surrounding the case and the graphic nature of the evidence that would be presented. The trial opened on the 25th of November, 2019, before Supreme Court Justice Stephen Hall. During proceedings, the court heard that 2 of the victims had defensive wounds, suggesting they fought back against their attacker. Edwards' DNA was found beneath Sierra Glennon's fingernails and was matched to the kimono from the earlier Huntingdale attack, though the defense argued this evidence might have been contaminated in the laboratory. One of the central pillars of the prosecution's case involved Telstra work vehicles. At the time of the murders, Edwards was employed as a Telstra technician, and prosecutors argued he used company vehicles after hours to commit the crimes. This was backed up by a security guard who recalled seeing a Telstra van parked, for no apparent reason, at Karrakatta Cemetery on multiple occasions, both after the 1995 attack and before Sarah Spears disappeared in 1996. The prosecutor, Carmel Barbagallo, presented this as part of what the state called the Telstra Living Witness Project. Evidence that between 1995 and 1997, a man driving a Telstra station wagon had been seen stopping to look at women and offering them rides. There was also a witness from a group of men known as the Burger Boys, who identified a Series 1 Holden Commodore versus station wagon, a car with distinctive teardrop hubcaps, cruising past them shortly after they saw Sierra Glennon walk by. As it turned out, between April 1996 and December 1998, Edwards had driven a white Versa Series wagon carrying Telstra logos. That very vehicle was tracked down and impounded on the same day as his arrest. The trial also heard that fibers matching the carpet in the rear of Edwards' vehicle matched fibers found on the bodies of both Jane Rimmer and Sierra Glennon, although the defense argued these fibers could have come from another source entirely, possibly another vehicle not included in the state's crime database. The trial finally concluded on the 25th of June, 2020, after 7 months of hearings involving evidence from more than 200 witnesses. Justice Hall then retired to consider his verdict, and there was speculation it might be delivered before Edwards' period of remand expired on the 24th of September, 2020. And that's exactly what happened. On the very last day of his custody period, Justice Hall handed down a 619-page written verdict. Edwards was found guilty of the murders of Jane Rimmer and Sierra Glennon. He was found not guilty of the murder of Sarah Spears, though the judge noted it was, quote, more likely than not that Edwards had been involved in her disappearance. On the 23rd of December, 2020, Edwards was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole after 40 years. Justice Hall said there was a high likelihood that Edwards would die in prison. Before we move on from Claremont, it's worth mentioning a few other cases that have been raised as possibly connected. Back in April 2008, journalist Liam Bartlett reported that police had told the father of a fourth missing woman, 22-year-old Julie Cutler, that his daughter was probably also a victim of the Claremont killer. Cutler was a university student from Fremantle who vanished after leaving a staff function at the Parmelia Hilton Hotel in Perth at 9 in the evening on the 20th of June, 1988. Her car was later found in the surf near the groin at Cotslow Beach 2 days later. Her fate, like Sarah Spears's, remains unknown. Other possible related cases include Lisa Brown, a 19-year-old sex worker who disappeared on the 10th of November, 1998, and Sarah McMahon, who disappeared at the age of 20 on the 8th of November, 2000. Case number 2, Ivan Milat, the backpacker murders. Our next case takes us into the Belanglo State Forest in New South Wales, and it centers on a man who will become one of the most notorious names in Australian criminal history, Ivan Robert Marco Milat, known to the media as the backpacker murderer. Ivan Milat was born on the 27th of December, 1944, to Sejpan Marko Milat, a Croatian immigrant and laborer, and Margaret Elizabeth Piddleston, an Australian national. Ivan was the fifth of their 14 children. The Milat family started out impoverished, living on a rural weatherboard cottage farm in Bossley Park, about 36 kilometers west of Sydney, before eventually relocating to Liverpool, New South Wales. By most accounts, Milat's parents worked hard to raise, educate, and discipline their children, sending all of them to Catholic schools. But family members described his father as having a violent temper fueled by alcoholism. Many of the 10 Milat boys were well known to local police, and they grew up comfortable handling knives and firearms, often spending their afternoons shooting at targets in the family yard. Even as a young boy, Milat's siblings recalled him displaying antisocial and psychopathic behavior, things like attacking animals with machetes, which eventually led to him being sent to a residential school at the age of 13. By 17, he was in a juvenile detention center for theft, and at 19 he was involved in a shop break-in. In 1964, he was sentenced to 18 months for breaking and entering. Just a month after his release, he was arrested again, this time for driving a stolen car, and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. In September 1967, at the age of 22, he was sentenced to 3 years for theft. On the 7th of April, 1971, Milat abducted 2 18-year-old female hitchhikers near Liverpool railway station. Using a knife to threaten them, he raped one of the hitchhikers before the group stopped at a petrol station cafe. where the two women managed to escape. Milat was arrested later that same day and charged with 1 count of rape and 2 counts of armed robbery. While he was awaiting trial, he took part in a string of robberies with some of his brothers, then faked his own suicide by leaving his shoes at the Gap, a well-known suicide site in Sydney. Authorities believe Milat then fled to Queensland and Victoria, before eventually flying to New Zealand, where he lived for 2 years. It's suspected he later returned to Australia, in secret using a fake passport, living interstate to avoid detection. He was rearrested in 1974 after his mother was hospitalized with a heart attack, but a robbery and kidnapping charges against him ultimately failed at trial, thanks to the help of the Milat family's lawyer, John Marsden. In 1975, Milat took a job as a truck driver, and by the time of his eventual arrest for murder, he'd worked on and off for the Roads and Traffic Authority for 20 years. In 1977, he unsuccessfully attempted to rape and murder 2 women hitchhiking from Liverpool to Canberra, though he was never charged with that attack. Now, let's get into the murders themselves. By the time investigators discovered the first bodies in Belanglo State Forest, several backpackers had already gone missing. One case involved a young couple from Frankston, Victoria, Deborah Everest and James Gibson, both 19, who had been missing since leaving Sydney for a music festival called Confius near Albury on the 30th of December, 1989. Other related disappearances included Simone Schmidl, a 21-year-old German woman, missing since leaving Sydney from Melbourne on the 20th of January, 1991. A German couple, Gabor Neugebauer, 21, and Anja Habschied, 20, who vanished after leaving a King's Cross hostel bound from Mildura on the 26th of December, 1991. And British backpackers Caroline Clark, 21, and Joanne Walters, 22, last seen in King's Cross on the 18th of April, 1992. On the 19th of September, 1992, 2 runners orienteering through Belanglo stumbled upon a concealed corpse. The very next morning, police found a second body just 30 meters away. Dental records quickly confirmed the 2 bodies belonged to Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters. Walters had been stabbed 15 times, 4 times in the chest, once in the neck, and 9 times in the back, wounds that would have left her paralyzed. Clark had been shot 10 times in the head at the burial site, and police believe she'd been used for target practice. After searching the forest thoroughly, investigators believe at the time that there were no further bodies to find. But on the 5th of October, 1993, a local man out searching for firewood found bones in a particularly remote section of the forest. He returned with police, and 2 more bodies were quickly discovered, later identified as James Gibson and Deborah Everest. Gibson's skeleton was found curled in a fetal position, showing 8 stab wounds. A large knife had cut through his upper spine, causing paralysis, and additional wounds to his back and chest would have punctured his heart and lungs. Everest had been savagely beaten. Her skull fractured in 2 places, her jaw broken, with knife marks across her forehead. She'd also been stabbed once in the back. Investigators were puzzled by the fact that Gibson's camera had been found on the 31st of December, 1989, and his backpack even later, on the 13th of March, 1990, both located over 120 kilometers north of Belanglo, near Galston Gorge. On the 1st of November, 1993, a skeleton was found in a clearing along a fire trail in Belanglo during a police sweep. It was identified as Simone Schmidl and showed at least 8 stab wounds, 2 of which had severed her spine, with others puncturing her heart and lungs. Clothing found at the scene didn't belong to Schmidl at all. It matched that of another missing backpacker, Anja Habschied. The bodies of Habschied and her partner Gabor Neugebauer were then found nearby on the 4th of November, 1993, buried in shallow graves 50 meters apart. Habschied had been decapitated, and despite an extensive search, her skull was never found. Neugebauer had been shot in the head 6 times. Evidence suggested that some of the victims had not died instantly from their wounds. Examinations of the remains showed signs that some victims had been tortured. In response, on the 14th of October, 1993, New South Wales Police established Task Force Air, made up of more than 20 detectives and analysts. On the 5th of November, the state government raised a reward for information to $500,000. As police developed a profile of the killer, they were faced with an overwhelming amount of data from countless sources. Using link analysis technology, they managed to narrow their suspect list from 230 down to just 32. At one point, speculation arose that the crimes might have been committed by several killers working together, given that most victims have been attacked in pairs, killed in different ways, and buried separately. The real breakthrough came on the 13th of November, when police were contacted by a man named Paul Onions, 24 years old, calling from the United Kingdom. Back on the 25th of January, 1990, Onions had been backpacking in Australia and, while hitchhiking from Liverpool Station toward Mildura, accepted a ride south out of Casual from a man who introduced himself only as Bill. South of the town of Mittagong, less than a kilometer from Belanglo, Bill suddenly pulled out a revolver and some rope, attempting to rob him. Onions managed to flee while Bill fired shots at him. He flagged down a passing motorist, a woman named Joan Berry from Canberra, and together they gave a description of the attacker and his vehicle, including its registration number, to police in Bowral. On the 13th of April, 1994, detectives rediscovered the original note about Onions' call. His account was corroborated by Berry, along with the girlfriend of the man who had worked alongside Milat. Police surveillance of the Milat family home on Cinnabar Street in Eagle Vale began on the 26th of February, 1994. Investigators soon learned that Milat had recently sold his silver Nissan Patrol shortly after the discovery of Clark and Walters' bodies. They also confirmed Milat had not been working on any of the days the attacks occurred, and acquaintances told police about his obsession with weapons. Once the connection was made between the Belanglo murders and Onions' experience, Onions flew back to Australia to assist the investigation. On the 5th of May, 1994, he positively identified Milat as the man who had picked him up and shot at him. Milat was arrested at his house on the 22nd of May on robbery and weapons charges connected to the Onions attack, after 50 police officers surrounded the property. A search of his home turned up various weapons, including a .22 caliber Anschutz rifle and parts of a .22 caliber Ruger rifle, matching the type used in the murders, a Browning pistol, and a Bowie knife. Police also uncovered items belonging to several of the victims. Homes belonging to Milat's mother and 5 of his brothers were searched too, revealing even more victims' belongings. Milat appeared in court on the 23rd of May, but did not enter a plea. On the 31st of May, he was additionally charged with all 7 backpacker murders. On the 28th of June, he sacked his family's longtime lawyer, John Marsden, and sought legal aid instead. Meanwhile, his brothers Richard and Walter faced separate trials over weapons, drugs, and stolen items found on their own properties. A committal hearing for Milat regarding the murders began on the 24th of October and ran until the 12th of December, with more than 200 witnesses appearing. Based on the evidence presented, Milat was remanded in custody at the start of February 1995 until that June. Milat's trial opened at the Supreme Court of New South Wales in Sydney on the 26th of March, 1996, prosecuted by Mark Tedeschi. Despite overwhelming evidence, Milat was reportedly confident he'd be found innocent. In phone recordings made years later for the ABC's Australian Story program, Milat explained his reasoning, saying that his basic defense was that it wasn't him, they didn't know who did it, and that it was up to prosecution to prove his guilt rather than for him to prove his innocence. His defense argued that despite the evidence, there was no direct proof of his guilt, and attempted to shift blame onto other family members, particularly his brother Richard. 145 witnesses took the stand, including Milat family members who tried to provide alibis. On the 18th of June, Milat gave evidence himself. On the 27th of July, 1996, after 18 weeks of testimony, the jury found Milat guilty of all the murders. He received a life sentence on each count, without the possibility of parole. He was also convicted of the attempted murder, false imprisonment, and robbery of Paul Onions, receiving 6 years imprisonment for each of those charges. Let's run through the victims one more time, in order. In 1989, on the 30th of December, Australians Deborah Everest and James Gibson, both 19, left Melbourne for Sydney, then set off hitchhiking toward a festival near Albury. Both were later found in Belanglo, Gibson stabbed and Everest beaten to death. In 1991, on the 20th of January, German backpacker Simone Schmidl, 20, set off hitchhiking from Sydney, telling friends she was meeting her mother, who was flying in from Germany. Her body was found in November 1993, showing numerous stab wounds, including one through her spinal column. Later that same year, on the 26th of December, German backpackers Gabor Neugebauer, 21, and Anja Habschied, 20, left a hostel in King's Cross to hitchhike toward Adelaide and Darwin. Both were found in Belanglo in November 1993. Neugebauer bound and shot 6 times. Habschied beheaded. In 1992, on the 18th of April, British citizens Joan Walters, 22, and Caroline Clark, 21, left King's Cross together, planning to hitchhike around Australia and pick fruit in Victoria. They were found in Belanglo in September that year. Walters stabbed, Clark shot 11 times. Life in prison for Milat was far from quiet. On his very first day at Maitland Jail, he was beaten by another inmate. Almost a year later, on the 16th of May, 1997, he attempted to escape alongside a convicted drug dealer and former Sydney councillor named George Savas. The plan failed, and Savas was found hanged in his cell the following day. Milat was then transferred to the maximum security section of Goulburn Correctional Centre. In November 1997, Milat appealed his convictions, arguing a breach of his common law right to legal representation. The New South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal dismissed it. In 2004, he applied to the High Court of Australia for special leave to appeal on new grounds. That application was also dismissed. On the 27th of October, 2005, his final avenue of appeal in the New South Wales Supreme Court was refused. 2 more application attempts were rejected in 2006, and another in November 2011. In 2001, Milat had been transferred to a new unit at the High Risk Management Correctional Center, known as Supermax, at Goulburn. In 2006, news that Milat had been given a toaster and television in his cell caused a public outcry. In his 2004 Australian Story interview, Milat denied that any family members had been involved in the murders. On the 26th of January, 2009, he cut off his own little finger with a plastic knife, intending to mail it to the High Court to force an appeal. He was taken to Goulburn-based hospital under heavy security, but on the 27th of January, doctors decided surgery wasn't possible and he was returned to prison. This wasn't his first act of self-harm. Back in 2001, he had swallowed razor blades, staples, and other metal objects. In May 2011, he went on a 9-day hunger strike, losing 25 kilograms in an unsuccessful bid to be given a PlayStation 3. In May 2019, Milat was transferred to Prince of Wales Hospital in Randwick and diagnosed with terminal esophageal cancer. Following treatment, he was moved back to Long Bay Correctional Center to continue serving his sentence. On the 9th of August 2019, a terminally ill Milat was moved to a secure treatment unit at Prince of Wales Hospital after losing 20 kilograms and developing a high temperature, though his condition was described as not life-threatening at that point. On the 27th of October, 2019, Milat died of esophageal and stomach cancer at 4:07 in the morning within the hospital wing at Long Bay Correctional Center. He was 74 years old. Before his death, Milat wrote to his family asking that his funeral expenses be covered by the New South Wales government. That request was denied by the state's corrections minister, Anthony Roberts, so his body was cremated with costs taken from his prison account. In his final days, New South Wales police revealed that officers had visited him 8 times, both in prison and in hospital, trying to secure a confession. He never gave one. Various strategies were used, including different combinations of detectives and even recorded interviews with victims' families, but no additional information was ever provided. Although Milat never officially confessed, he reportedly admitted responsibility to his mother, with whom he shared a close bond. Police have long maintained that Milat may have been involved in more murders than the 7 he was convicted of. State and territory investigations that began in 1993 compared his known criminal profile and modus operandi against dozens of cold cases, eventually compiling a list of 58 people, including individuals from the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, Italy, and New Zealand. Because Milat's work as a truck driver in the mid-1970s took him across huge stretches of the country: Sydney, Canberra, Brisbane, the Gold Coast, Newcastle, Wollongong, Melbourne, Adelaide, and Perth. Investigators identified 3 unsolved murders with striking similarities to his known pattern, according to Task Force Commander Clive Small. These included the 1971 murder of pregnant 20-year-old Karen Rowland near Canberra, the 1987 murder of 18-year-old hitchhiker Peter Letcher near the Jenolan Caves, and the 1991 murder of 29-year-old Mother Diane Pinocchio near Bungendore. Investigators also looked into a series of unsolved disappearances of young women in the Hunter region during the late 1970s, including Leanne Goodall, Robin Hickey, Amanda Robinson, Amanda Zoles, Annette Briffa, and Susan Issenhood. Given Milat's known presence in the area as a road worker at the time, he was named a person of interest in several of these cases during a 2001 inquest, though no charges were ever filed due to insufficient evidence. Media outlets have also speculated about Milat's potential involvement in a number of other unsolved disappearances and murders stretching from the early 1970s through to 1992, involving hitchhiking victims across Victoria, Queensland, and New South Wales, though none of these connections were ever proven in court. On a personal note, Milat, then 38, met 16-year-old Karen Duck in 1983, who was pregnant with his cousin's child at the time. They married in 1984 and had 1 daughter together. Duck left him in 1987 due to domestic violence, and they divorced in October 1989. At trial, she described him as, quote, gun crazy, recalling watching him kill kangaroos on a visit to Belanglo State Forest. In a chilling postscript to this case, Milat's great-nephew, Matthew Milat, along with his friend Cohen Klein, were sentenced in 2012 to 43 and 32 years in prison respectively for murdering a young man named David Ochterlony in Belanglo State Forest in November 2010 on Ochterlony's 17th birthday. In 2005, John Marsden, Milat's former lawyer, made a deathbed statement claiming Milat had been assisted in the killing of the 2 British backpackers by his sister, Shirley Swar. In May 2015, Milat's brother Boris told a former homicide detective that Milat had admitted responsibility for accidentally shooting a taxi driver named Neville Knight with shotgun during an attempted robbery back in 1962, when Milat was just 17. Knight was left paralyzed from the waist down, and an innocent man, Alan Dillon, was wrongly convicted and served 5 years in prison for that crime. Authorities never formally charged Milat over this incident, although investigators noted striking similarities between it and the way Milat would later paralyze many of his murder victims before killing them. Case number 3. Paul Charles Denier, the Frankston serial killer. Our third case takes us to Melbourne and to a killer known as the Frankston serial killer, whose crimes unfolded over just 5 terrifying months in 1993. Paul Charles Denier was born on the 14th of April, 1972, in Campbelltown, New South Wales. His parents, Anthony and Maureen, had met and married in London in the early 1960s before migrating to Australia in 1965. Paul was the third of their 6 children. The family relocated to Victoria in 1981 due to his father's new job. Denier struggled to fit in at his new school, which caused problems with his studies and self-confidence, made worse by significant weight gain during his teenage years. The warning signs were there early. At age 10, he slashed the throat of his sister's Care Bear toy and cut the throat of the family cat before hanging it in a tree. Just before he turned 13, he was charged and cautioned for stealing a car. At 15, he was arrested for assaulting a fellow student who had been forced to publicly masturbate. Around this time, his parents divorced. After leaving school, he struggled to hold down a job, was fired 7 times, and failed a physical exam when he tried to join the Victoria Police. In February 1993, he started working at a boat-building firm in Seaford called Pro Marine. Shortly after he began, colleagues noticed him making knives at work. He was eventually let go for failing to complete his assigned tasks. In the years and months before the murders, Denier began stalking and attacking a number of women around the Melbourne suburb of Frankston. The very first known incident happened in February 1993, when a woman named Donna Vaines had her unit on Claude Street in Seaford broken into. After receiving an anonymous threatening phone call, Vaines had become fearful of being alone, so she asked her boyfriend to take her and their newborn baby out while he delivered pizzas. When they returned home about an hour later, they found blood on the floor and discovered one of their cats had been killed. Police were called, and an officer found the cat had been killed and dissected with a pornographic image placed on its body, written above the stove in the cat's blood were the words, quote, "Donna, you're dead." In the bathroom, police found 2 more kittens, their throats also cut, floating in the bathtub. Shaving cream had been sprayed across a bedroom mirror, and more pornographic images, slashed apart, had been posted on a wardrobe alongside other slashed furniture. The intruder had even placed a slashed pornographic image inside the crib of Vaines's baby. Unwilling to stay in the unit, she moved in with her sister, who happened to live in a unit right next door to Denier, and whose own neighbor had also recently been the victim of a break-in. After Denier's eventual arrest, he admitted to police he was responsible for the break-in, the vandalism, and the killing of Vaines's cats. He told police that if Vaines had been home that night, he would have murdered her. The first known murder victim was 18-year-old Elizabeth Stevens, who had moved to Melbourne from Tasmania in January 1993 to study at TAFE Frankston, with hopes of eventually joining the armed forces. At approximately 7 in the evening on Friday, the 11th of June, 1993, Stevens got off a bus on Cranbourne Road, the closest stop to the home on Patterson Avenue in Langwarrin, where she'd been living with her aunt and uncle for the past 6 months. As she turned into Patterson Avenue, she was grabbed from behind and threatened with what appeared to be a gun. She screamed, but heavy rain and wind meant no one heard her. Her attacker told her to be quiet, then walked her down the street, holding her hand to avoid drawing suspicion. Several witnesses who passed them actually assumed they were a couple. They ended up at Lloyd Park Reserve. Stevens was first sexually propositioned, then told she wasn't in sexual danger. She was then strangled, stabbed, and had her throat cut. Her killer then stomped on her face, breaking several facial bones, before dragging her a short distance to a culvert. She suffered a number of further wounds after death, including additional stabbing and slashing across her torso. That morning, Stevens had left a note for her relatives saying she'd be studying at either TAFE or the city library and would be home by 8 that evening. When she didn't arrive, her relatives initially assumed she was simply running late. By 10:30 p.m., her uncle had begun driving around searching for her. Police were notified soon after and grew concerned once they saw the note she'd left. Her body was found around 5 the following afternoon by a man collecting pine branches. She had been killed just 250 meters from her home. At the post-mortem, the forensic pathologist noted signs consistent with strangulation. The official cause of death was recorded as aspiration of blood and hemorrhage from stab wounds to the neck in a woman whose neck had been compressed. Police conducted an extensive search of the area, discovering a bag containing Stevens's books and documents, along with a knife blade. Every resident in the vicinity was interviewed. Officers even rode the local bus, hoping someone would recognize Stevens. But no solid leads emerged. A month later, on Thursday the 8th of July, 41-year-old Rasa Toft got off at Seaford Railway Station and headed north along Railway Parade toward home. Around 5:50 in the evening, as she passed Seaford North Reserve, she noticed a man loitering near a toilet block. She was attacked shortly after walking past him and dragged toward the unlit park, but managed to break free after her attacker held a fake gun to her head. She quickly realized it wasn't real. After a prolonged struggle, she finally broke away. Shaken, with only minor injuries, she ran back to the road, flagged down a car, and was driven home, where police were called. That same night, the second murder victim, 22-year-old Deborah Freem, who lived near Cannock Station in Seaford, was abducted from her own car in the early evening. She had left her 12-day-old son at home, a male friend, while she went out at 7 to buy milk for an omelet. By 8, when she hadn't returned, her friend called her boyfriend, the police, and the local hospital to check for accidents. The 2 men drove around searching for her, before eventually reporting her missing at Frankston Police Station. On the afternoon of Monday, the 12th of July, a farmer discovered Freem's partially covered body on Taylor's Road in Carham Downs. Like Stevens, she had been strangled, this time with a cord, savagely slashed and her throat cut. On Friday, the 30th of July, the third and final victim, 17-year-old schoolgirl Natalie Russell, was attacked while walking home from John Paul College. By this time, there had already been significant media coverage, heightened public fear, and warnings issued by her school. Russell usually cycled to school with her brother, but that day her mother had driven her instead As a precaution, she left school early alone, taking her usual shortcut home to Frankston North via a fenced walkway between two golf courses on Sky Road, a path now known as Nat's Track in her memory. At 8 that evening, Russell was reported missing to Frankston Police Station, and a search soon located her body. She'd been dragged off the path through a large hole cut in a wire fence into nearby scrub, and had died in a manner similar to the other victims. During the attack, though, she had put up a considerable fight, and that fight proved crucial because it left behind DNA evidence at the scene. Let's talk about how the investigation came together. Police first became involved after the break-in incidents at Vaines's unit in February 1993. The murder of Elizabeth Stevens triggered a large-scale investigation, as did the disappearance of Deborah Freem, which involved a search using scuba divers examining Canonook Creek. At the Stevens scene, no external forensic evidence had been found, and no witnesses had come forward. With Freem, again, no foreign forensic evidence turned up due to poor weather, but it was clear she'd fought back. Witnesses recalled her gray Nissan Pulsar being seen driving erratically with its high beams flashing. Her unlocked car was found the next day on nearby Madden Street, and forensic examination revealed traces of her blood inside, a new dent on the front, and the driver's seat pushed back. Denier later explained that he found her car unlocked at the milk bar, climbed into the back seat, and threatened her with a replica gun shortly after she drove off. After the attack on Rosatov, police used her description of the attacker, 18 to 20 years old, about 180 centimeters tall, round-faced blue eyes, to build a suspect profile, a male, likely unemployed or in a menial job, probably a local resident, aged 18 to 24, average-looking, living alone. As media scrutiny and community concern intensified, it became increasingly clear to investigators that these separate incidents were connected. Police also suspected possible links to the 1990 disappearance of Sarah McDermott and the 1992 murder of Michelle Brown. In the lead-up to Russell's murder, 200 investigators were working through a plan to visit 4,700 homes triangulated around Madden Street in Frankston. The operation, codenamed Operation Pulsar after Freem's car, was at the time the largest door knock ever conducted by Victoria Police. The attack on Natalie Russell finally gave police the breakthrough they needed. At 2:30 in the afternoon, a postal worker spotted a rusty yellow Toyota Corona without number plates parked near Nat's Track on Sky Road, with a man inside using binoculars and acting suspiciously. As she stopped at a nearby house to call police, she watched Russell approach the track alone, observed by the suspicious man, who then ran up the path after her. Police responded and noted the car's registration details and door-knocked a few nearby houses, but had to leave to respond to another call before the man returned. Later forensic examination of the walkway revealed 3 holes cut into the fence using the same tool, with blood traces on one of them, along with skin and hair traces on Russell's body that didn't belong to her. Police traced the registration details to the car's owner, Paul Charles Denier. Detectives visited his small unit on Frankston Dandenong Road in Seaford, which he shared with his girlfriend, and which happened to be right next door to the sister of Donna Vanes, on the afternoon of the 31st of July. While checking his movements, Denier admitted to being in the vicinity of both the Freem and Russell murders around the time they occurred. He was then taken to Frankston Police Station, where his videoed interview began at 9:20 that night. He was unable to adequately explain the cuts and scratches officers noticed on him, and also admitted being in the area during the Stevens attack. He agreed to have his DNA collected, and early on the 1st of August, suspecting police already had DNA evidence against him, he confessed to all 3 murders, the Toth assault, and the earlier slasher break-ins. Denier told detectives he had been stalking women in the Frankston area for years, and that his motivation was a desire to kill that he carried since the age of 14, along with general hatred of girls and women. Denier was charged with 3 counts of murder and 1 of abduction. He pleaded guilty and did not contest the charges. Psychologists and other experts who examined him noted a striking lack of emotion regarding his crimes, a single-minded desire to kill, and an unusual randomness in how his victims were chosen, ultimately leading to a diagnosis of sadistic personality disorder, though not legal insanity. His treating forensic psychologist, Dr. Ian Joblin, wrote that Denier found intentional maltreatment of his victims intensely gratifying, taking pleasure in their torment and suffering, and that, unlike simple anger, his behavior was fully premeditated. The more aggressive he became, the more powerful he felt. During examination, Denier admitted he had been influenced by the 1987 film The Stepfather. On the 20th of December, 1993, after 4 days of hearings, Denier was sentenced in Melbourne Supreme Court to 3 consecutive life sentences with no minimum parole period. On the 31st of December, he lodged an appeal, which was heard in July 1994, and resulted in him being granted a non-parole period of 30 years, running until 2023. Denier was initially sent to a facility known as MAP, where he befriended another inmate named Robert Lowe, before later being transferred to HM Prison Barwon, and he currently resides at Port Phillip Prison. In January 2004, after 10 years behind bars, Denier became the subject of a 7:30 report segment titled, quote, "Murder's Sex Change Request Sparks Rights Debate." In September 2004, news broke of a letter Denier had sent to his estranged brother, who he had accused during his trial of sexually abusing him as a child, and to his sister-in-law, who had since re-emigrated to the United Kingdom. In July 2012, Denier again made headlines over allegations involving 4 rapes carried out over a 6-week period. In April 2013, a newspaper published a series of letters Denier had written in 2003 and 2004 to another inmate, alongside analysis of his handwriting. Now, an important part of the story involves Denier's gender identity. According to the first of these published letters, dated the 29th of November, 2003, Denier began identifying as a woman that same year. He has claimed that feelings of gender dysphoria were what led him to seek revenge against women by murdering them. In one letter, dated the 4th of February, 2004, he wrote, quote, "I committed these disgusting crimes not because I ever hated womankind, but because I have never really felt that I was male." He began wearing women's clothing and cosmetics in prison, in defiance of prison rules. Medical specialists evaluated whether he could receive sex reassignment surgery and rejected the idea. Prisoner support groups argued that his commitment to transitioning had to be genuine, given the personal risk it involved behind bars. One victim's mother said Denier's transition made her and her husband feel sick, calling it a stunt. In more recent years, as covered in the 2022 Stan documentary No Mercy, No Remorse, presenter John Sylvester has stated that Denier has since reverted to identifying as Paul. In 2023, Denier became eligible for parole and applied for release, but the Adult Parole Board of Victoria denied his application. The board notified the victims' families, including Natalie Russell's father Brian and Deborah Freem's son Jake, who had been just 12 days old when his mother was murdered. Case number 4, Peter Dupas, the breast removal killer. Now we move to a case involving one of Australia's most disturbing repeat offenders, a man whose criminal history spans more than 3 decades, and who is currently serving 3 life sentences without parole. His name is Peter Norris Dupas. Dupas was born on the 6th of July, 1953, the youngest of 3 children in what has been described as a fairly normal family. Born in Sydney, his family moved to Melbourne while he was still a toddler. Since both his siblings were considerably older, his elderly parents raised him much like an only child. He left high school after completing grade 10, but later obtained his higher school certificate. The warning signs came early and violently. On the 3rd of October, 1968, at just 15 years old, Dupas visited his next-door neighbor and asked to borrow a knife to peel vegetables. Instead, he stabbed the woman in the face, neck, and hand as she fought to defend herself. He later told police he simply couldn't help himself and didn't know why he'd attacked her. He was placed on 18 months probation and admitted to Larundel Psychiatric Hospital for evaluation, but released after just 2 weeks and treated only as an outpatient. In October 1969, a mortuary at Austin Hospital was broken into, and the bodies of 2 elderly women were mutilated using a pathologist's knife. One body showed a strange wound in the thigh area, inflicted with a knife. Police believe Dupas was involved, since the wounds matched those found on a later murder victim, Nicole Patterson. A senior detective named Ian Armstrong, who interviewed Dupas in November 1973, described him as weak and compliant when confronted by authority, but said he could tell the young man was pure evil, that his attacks were carefully planned, showing no remorse, and that he was an unmitigated liar who would likely go all the way if not stopped. On the 25th of July, 1974, Dupas was sentenced to 9 years imprisonment, with a minimum of 5, for breaking into a woman's home, threatening her with a knife, tying her up, and raping her, even threatening to harm her baby when she resisted. The sentencing judge called it one of the worst rapes imaginable. A prison psychiatrist later noted that Dupas remained in constant denial about his criminal activity, describing him as potentially dangerous and extremely difficult to treat. In 1979, roughly 2 months after his release, Dupas molested women in 4 separate attacks over just 10 days. On the 28th of February, 1980, he received a 5-year minimum sentence on charges, including assault with intent to rape, malicious wounding, assault with intent to rob, and indecent assault. A report from that time described him as extremely disturbed, immature, and dangerous, and stated that his release on parole had been a mistake. Dupas was released again in February 1985. About a month later, he raped a 21-year-old woman on a beach in Blairgowrie, Victoria, following her from her car and holding her down at knife point. He later told police he was sorry, that everyone had told him he was fine now, and that he never thought it would happen again. On the 28th of June, 1985, he was sentenced to 12 years imprisonment for the Blairgowrie rape and released in 1992 after serving 7 years. Less than 2 years later, Dupas was arrested for false imprisonment after an incident at Lake Epilogue in January 1994. Wearing a hood and armed with a knife, tape, and handcuffs, he followed a woman who was picnicking and held her at knife point in a toilet block, but was chased off by her friends. As he fled the scene, he crashed his car and was caught. On the 18th of August, 1994, he pleaded guilty to 1 count of false imprisonment and was sentenced to 3 years and 9 months, with a minimum of 2 years and 9 months. In September 1996, Dupas was released once more and moved into a house in the Melbourne suburb of Pascoe Vale. Nicole Patterson was a 28-year-old psychotherapist and youth counselor working with the Ardoc Youth Foundation, an organization supporting young drug users. She had wanted to build her own private practice and was using her Northcote home as an office, placing classified ads in a local paper, the Northcote Leader, to grow her client base. 2 neighbors reported hearing a young woman screams coming from Patterson's house between 9 and 9:30 in the morning on the day of her murder. When her boyfriend's attempts to reach her that afternoon failed, suspicions were raised. On the 19th of April, 1999, Patterson's body was found by a friend in the front room of her Harper Street home in Northcote. Her friend had come to pick her up for a dinner engagement, and hearing music play with the front door unlocked, went inside and discovered the severely mutilated body. Patterson had died from 27 stab wounds to her chest and back. Her body was found naked from the waist down, her skirt discarded in a nearby bedroom, underwear around her ankles. Small pieces of yellow PVC tape were attached to her body, and both of her breasts had been removed with a sharp knife. Her handbag and driver's license had been stolen. Neither the murder weapon nor her breasts have ever been recovered. Investigators found that Patterson had a 9 o'clock appointment scheduled that morning with a new client named, quote, Malcolm, noted in her diary alongside a mobile number. That number traced back to an Indian student at La Trobe University named Harry, who told police Dupas had approached him with an offer of laboring work. On the 22nd of April, 1999, police arrested Dupas at midday at the Excelsior Hotel in Thomastown and charged him with Patterson's murder that same day. Phone records revealed Dupas had made 3 calls to Patterson to arrange counseling for depression and a gambling addiction, the first from a public phone booth roughly 6 weeks before her murder. Over the following weeks, he called repeatedly, seemingly trying to establish how vulnerable she was. Dupas later told police he had actually canceled his appointment after Patterson told him his problem was something he could work through himself. Police also noticed scratches on Dupas' face and hand, consistent with a struggle. He initially claimed the injuries came from working in his backyard shed and being struck by a piece of wood from a lathe. Despite not owning a lathe, he later changed his story to say he'd been hit while walking past a protruding piece of wood. A search of his home turned up blood-stained clothing, PVC tape matching that found at the crime scene, a ski mask, newspaper clippings about the murder, and the very newspaper page containing Patterson's own advertisement for her counseling services. After deliberating for less than 3 hours, the jury returned a guilty verdict. On the 22nd of August, 2000, sentencing Dupas to life imprisonment without any possibility of parole, Judge Frank Vincent remarked that Dupas' prospects for rehabilitation were so close to hopeless they could be effectively discounted, that there was no indication he had ever felt any remorse, and that he doubted Dupas was even capable of such a human response. The judge said Dupas presented, for all of them, an awful, threatening, and unanswerable question about how a person comes to be as he is. In August 2001, Dupas appealed his conviction to the Supreme Court of Victoria Court of Appeal, but the appeal was dismissed. Margaret Josephine Marr was a 40-year-old sex worker in Melbourne, last seen alive at a Safeway supermarket at 12:20 in the morning in Broadmeadows on the 4th of October, 1997. Her body was discovered under a cardboard box of computer parts at 1:45 that afternoon by a man collecting aluminum with his wife and her sister beside Clifford's Road in Somerton. A black woolen glove found near her body would later be confirmed to contain Dupas' DNA. A post-mortem revealed Marr had suffered a stab wound to her left wrist, bruising to her neck, blunt force trauma to her right eyebrow from a cinder block, and lacerations to her right arm. Her left breast had been removed and placed inside her mouth. At the time of her murder, Dupas had been out of prison for just over a year following his rape sentence, and was no longer under supervision from Corrections Victoria. He was already serving a life sentence for Patterson's murder by the time he was arrested for Marr's killing. Once in custody, police were able to obtain a DNA sample linking him to the 1997 case. During a trial lasting 3 weeks, the prosecution argued that the removal of both Patterson's and Marr's breasts was so strikingly similar as to represent a signature or trademark, identifying Dupas as the killer of both women. The jury, who were not told he was already serving a life sentence for the first murder, took less than a day to convict him. Upon hearing the guilty verdict, Dupas shouted that it was a kangaroo court before being led away. Patterson's sister, Kylie Nicholas, described him afterward as the most evil predator, a psychopath, a rare kind of evil that had destroyed these women's lives and their families along with them. Forensic psychologist Ian Joblin submitted a report to the court explaining that Dupas attacked women to fulfill fantasies of conquest and control, that the actual assault never lived up to the fantasy that preceded it, leaving him feeling unreassured and driving him to seek out another victim, this time the right one, making his offending repetitive. On the 16th of August, 2004, Dupas was convicted of Marr's murder and sentenced to a second term of life imprisonment. During sentencing, the judge remarked he would have handed down a life sentence for Marr's murder alone, even without the Patterson conviction, given Dupas' appalling criminal history and the seriousness of the crime. The judge stated that Dupas' offending, both in this case and in his previous convictions, was connected to a need to vindicate a perverted and sadistic hatred of women, and that he had intentionally killed a defenseless woman with no way to protect herself, just as he had done to all his other victims. The judge found no prospect of rehabilitation and declined to fix any minimum term. On the 25th of July, 2005, Dupas appealed this conviction too, and it was also dismissed. Marcina Halvages was a 25-year-old Melbourne woman murdered on the 1st of November, 1997, while visiting her grandmother's grave in the Greek Orthodox section of Fawner Cemetery. The alarm was raised by her fiancé after she failed to meet him later that day as planned. Her body was found at 4:35 in the morning on the 5th of November by her fiancé in an empty Plot 3 graves from where her grandmother was buried. Police believe she was attacked from behind while kneeling to tend to a flower arrangement and died from massive injuries, including 87 stab wounds concentrated around her knees, neck, and breasts. Her upper clothing had been pulled up over her head toward her chest. Dupas' home on Cone Street in Pascoe Vale was near the cemetery. Halvages' murder had remained unsolved since 1997, with the Victorian government and police offering a $1 million reward, at the time, the fourth such reward in the state's history. An elderly Pascoe Vale resident named Frank Cole later claimed he saw Dupas leaving Fawner Cemetery on the day of the murder, and an anonymous woman visiting her own parents' grave that day also recalled seeing Dupas jogging casually through the cemetery, wearing sunglasses. An inquest before coroner Graham Johnstone heard circumstantial evidence connecting Dupas to the case. 9 witnesses identified him as a man they'd seen at the cemetery that day. His grandfather's gravesite was located just 128 meters from the crime scene. He frequented a nearby pub called the First and Last Hotel, located opposite the cemetery. He had lied to police about a facial injury he sustained around the time of the attack and had attempted to alter his appearance afterward. He was also identified from police photographs by a woman who said she'd seen him just minutes before the attack, 20 meters from where it occurred. A senior detective told the inquest that a car known to have been used by Dupas at the time was sold to a work associate the month after Halvageus' murder, then later crushed for scrap and never examined. Forensic pathologist Professor David Ransom compared the wounds inflicted on Halvageus to those suffered by Patterson and Marr, but told the inquest there wasn't enough evidence to determine whether the same knife or the same person was responsible. Dupas' lawyer, David Drake, argued that the only real evidence linking his client to murder was his proximity to the cemetery and his history of similar offenses. On the 1st of August, 2006, the inquest was adjourned indefinitely after police charged Dupas with Halvageus' murder. Police had obtained a court order to interview Dupas about the case after disgraced Melbourne lawyer Andrew Fraser revealed that Dupas had confessed to the killing while the two were gardening together at Port Phillip Prison in 2002. Fraser described finding a homemade knife hidden among weeds and calling Dupas over to look at it. Dupas took it, almost caressing it in a sexual way, and began repeating the name, quote, Mercina, Mercina, with a strange look on his face. Fraser told police he had no doubt Dupas was the killer. He described how the two men spoke regularly, just the two of them over months, and how on one occasion, another prisoner confronted Dupas directly, yelling that he had killed Mercina. After that prisoner left, Dupas reportedly turned to Fraser and asked how that person knew he'd done it. After agreeing to testify against Dupas, Fraser was released early from Fulham Correctional Center on the 11th of September, 2006, 2 months before the end of his own sentence for drug trafficking. The Victorian government stated he was eligible to apply for a share of the $1 million reward. The Director of Public Prosecutions withdrew the murder charge in the magistrate's court and sent the case directly to trial, bypassing the usual committal hearing process. Dupas' lawyer argued this was unfair, but the Supreme Court ruled that Dupas would face trial without a committal hearing. He requested the chance to cross-examine Andrew Fraser before the criminal trial, and the court ultimately ordered him presented directly to trial in December 2006. The trial for Halvageus' murder ran for 22 days. On the 9th of July, 2007, the jury was discharged over a legal technicality after prosecutor Colin Hillman informed the judge that potential jurors hadn't been properly advised of the trial's likely duration, as required by the Jury Act. Andrew Fraser testified for prosecution, describing Dupas' attack on Halvageus in detail, and later submitted his own claim for the reward money. Dupas was found guilty of Halvageus' murder on the 9th of August, 2007, and appeared for a pre-sentencing hearing 8 days later. He was sentenced to a third life term with no minimum term, in a sentencing hearing that was the only televised sentencing in Australia since the 1995 sentencing of child killer Nathan John Avent. The judge told him plainly that life means life. On the 10th of September, 2007, Dupas' lawyers appealed, arguing the guilty verdict was unsafe and unsatisfactory. On the 17th of September, 2009, Dupas' appeal was upheld by a 2-to-1 majority in Victoria's Court of Appeal, which ruled the trial judge's directions had been inadequate. In October 2009, his lawyers argued the case against him should be permanently stayed due to the publicity surrounding it, but the judge disagreed and set a new trial date. On the 26th of October, 2010, a retrial for Halvageus' murder began, and on the 19th of November, 2010, after 3.5 days of jury deliberation, Dupas was convicted a second time. On the 26th of November, 2010, he was sentenced once more to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Beyond his 3 confirmed murder convictions, Dupas is also suspected in several other unsolved killings. Helen McMahon, a 47-year-old woman, was found beaten to death on a beach at Rye on the 13th of February, 1985. While sunbathing topless. Her body was found naked, covered by her own towel. The location was near where Dupas had earlier committed the Blairgowrie rape. It was originally believed Dupas was in prison at the time, but investigators later discovered he'd actually been on pre-release leave, living in the Rye area. Police believe McMahon may have been his first murder victim, though her case officially remains unsolved. Dupas is also a suspect in the 1993 murder of 31-year-old Renita Brunton, who was stabbed 106 times in the kitchen of her second-hand clothing store in Sunbury, and in the 1997 murder of 95-year-old Kathleen Downs, stabbed to death at a nursing home in Brunswick, a case where investigators found records showing Dupas had called a nursing home shortly before the murder. He was formally charged with Downs' murder in February 2018. While in prison at Melbourne's Pentridge Prison, Dupas had formed a relationship with a mental health nurse named Grace McConnell, 16 years a senior, and the two married in 1987 inside Castlemaine Jail. During the Halvageous inquest, McConnell described how Dupas insisted he was in love with her and believed that with her help he could become a normal person, and how she agreed to marry him not out of love, but from a sense of responsibility. She described their sex life as almost non-existent, and said she eventually could not bear him touching her. She found him self-obsessed, lazy, needy, and a snob, and they divorced in the mid-1990s. As of the summary of his convictions, Dupas had 16 prior convictions for acts of sexual violence across 6 court appearances before his first murder conviction, spanning from March 1972 through to November 1994. Prison staff have described him as a model prisoner while in custody, and as a monster whenever he was released. Case number 5, Malcolm Naden, Australia's most wanted fugitive. This next case is a little different from the others we've covered tonight, because a large part of the story isn't about a trial, it's about a manhunt. This is the story of Malcolm John Naden. Naden was born on the 5th of November, 1973. At the time of his eventual capture in March 2012, he had spent years as one of Australia's most wanted men, and his arrest attracted international media coverage. From June 2005 until March 2012, Naden lived in hiding, wanted over 2 murders and an indecent assault offense. He was, at the time, the most wanted man in the state of New South Wales. In June 2005, a young woman named Christy Scholes was found strangled to death in the West Dubbo home of her boyfriend's grandparents. Just a few days later, her boyfriend's cousin, Malcolm Naden, disappeared from that very same home. Before Scholes' murder, Naden had already been named as a suspect in the disappearance of another cousin, Letitia Nolan, who had been reported missing back in January 2005. What followed was one of the longest manhunts in Australian history. In December 2005, police closed the Western Plains Zoo in Dubbo after Naden was sighted there. Over the following month, there was a confirmed sighting near Lightning Ridge. In March 2006, he avoided capture at an Aboriginal mission near Condobolin. By January 2007, police were offering a $50,000 reward for information leading to his arrest. By January 2009, he was believed to be near Kempsey, and by August 2010, he was thought to be living in dense bushland around Gloucester and Scone. By early 2011, the reward had doubled to $100,000, and by December that year had been raised again to $250,000. On the 7th of December 2011, a police officer from the Tactical Operations Unit was shot by Naden during an unsuccessful operation to capture him in bushland near Nowandock. Naden was subsequently charged with the attempted murder of that officer. Finally, on the 22nd of March, 2012, Naden was captured in a rundown cabin approximately 30 kilometers west of Gloucester, taken down by heavily armed officers from the Tactical Operations Unit during a night operation. He was charged with the murder of Christy Scholes and appeared in court later that same day, where he was refused bail. On the 14th of April, 2012, Naden was escorted from Goulburn Correctional Center to Dubbo, where he assisted police by identifying a site at Butler's Falls, south of Dubbo, a location suspected to be where the remains of his cousin Letitia Nolan had been buried. At the time, though, no remains were actually found there. Naden was nonetheless later charged with Nolan's murder, along with 14 counts each of burglary and theft committed while he'd been on the run. It wasn't until early December 2016 that police disclosed remains had finally been found near that original site, and DNA testing confirmed they belonged to Nolan. In 2013, Naden pleaded guilty to 18 offenses, including the murders of both Scholes and Nolan. He received a minimum sentence of 21 years for Nolan's murder and a life sentence for the murder of Scholes. Other charges included the attempted murder of the police officer in 2011, breaking-and-enter offenses, and the indecent assault of a 12-year-old girl. Justice Derek Price said Naden had shown no remorse and posed a high risk of reoffending, since he had threatened to kill again, telling him that life outside of prison was simply not an option for him. Naden reportedly responded, quote, "Thank you, Your Honor." On the 24th of November, 2013, while serving his sentence, Naden was attacked by his second cousin, Dean Nolan, a relative of Letitia Nolan, who was serving a 24-year sentence at the same facility. Nolan, armed with a handle from a sandwich toaster, struck Naden repeatedly in the head before being stopped by prison staff. He later claimed the attack was retribution for the heartache Naden had caused his family, and received an additional 12 months on top of his existing sentence. The dramatic story of Naden's capture was later dramatized for television, airing on the 7 Network on the 11th of September, 2013, as part of an episode of The Force, Behind the Line, focused on Strike Force Durkin, the operation that finally brought him in. Case number 6, the Snowtown murders, bodies in the barrels. Now we come to one of the most horrifying cases in this entire list. A case so notorious it changed the identity of an entire small town. This is the story of the Snowtown murders, also known as the Bodies in Barrels murders, committed by John Justin Bunting, Robert Joe Wagner, and James Spiriton Vlasakis between August 1992 and May 1999 in and around Adelaide, South Australia. A fourth man, Mark Hayden, was convicted of helping dispose of the bodies. The resulting trial became one of the longest and most publicized in Australian legal history. Most of the victims' remains were discovered in barrels inside an abandoned bank vault in the small town of Snowtown, roughly 140 kilometers north of Adelaide, which is how the case got its name. Even though only one of the 12 victims was actually killed in Snowtown itself, and none of the 3 killers were from the town. Although the exact motivation behind the murders remains unclear, the killers have been led by Bunting to believe that their victims were pedophiles, homosexuals, or simply, quote, weak. In several cases, the murders were preceded by torture and efforts were made to steal victims' identities, social security payments, and bank accounts. Let's meet the people at the center of this case. John Justin Bunting, born on the 4th of September, 1966, was found to be the ringleader. As an 8-year-old, he had been beaten and sexually assaulted by a friend's older brother. He reportedly enjoyed weaponry, photography, and anatomy, and developed a strong hatred toward pedophiles and homosexuals. At 22, he worked in an abattoir, where he bragged about slaughtering animals, saying it was what he enjoyed most. He moved to a house in Salisbury North in 1991, where he befriended his neighbors Mark Hayden and Robert Wagner. Robert Joe Wagner, born on the 28th of November, 1971, was befriended by Bunting in 1991, and Bunting gradually encouraged him to help with the murders. Like Bunting, Wagner had previously been active in several neo-Nazi groups. James Spiriton Vlasakis, born on the 24th of December, 1979, lived with Bunting alongside his mother and half-brother, and was slowly drawn into helping with the killings. At 19, Vlasakis helped torture and kill his own half-brother, Troy Yud, and his stepbrother, David Johnson. In 2001, he confessed to 4 murders, including Johnson's, and became a key witness for the Crown. The detail he provided, backed by other evidence, was instrumental in convicting Bunting and Wagner. He was sentenced in 2002 to a minimum of 26 years and held in isolation at an unidentified South Australian prison. In early August 2025, it was announced that Vlasakis would be granted parole, but that decision was overturned in a subsequent review. Elizabeth Harvey, Vlasakis' mother, also knew about the murders and, with Bunting's encouragement, assisted in one of them. After Bunting, Wagner, Vlasakis, and Hayden were taken into custody, she died from cancer. Mark Ray Hayden, born on the 4th of December, 1958, was an associate of Bunting who was initially protected by suppression orders and couldn't be publicly identified beyond being an alleged perpetrator. In January 1999, he reportedly rented the abandoned State Bank building in Snowtown. A jury deadlocked on murder charges relating to his own wife, Elizabeth Hayden, and to Troy Yud. Those charges weren't retried after Hayden pleaded guilty to helping the killers dispose of the 2 bodies. He was released from prison in May 2024. Jody Elliott, sister of Elizabeth Hayden, was a woman with below-average intelligence who had become infatuated with Bunting. To claim Social Security income, she pretended to be Suzanne Allen, a deceased former acquaintance of Bunting's. Her son, Frederick Brooks, was later killed by the group. Now let's talk about how the victims were chosen. Bunting selected targets for what were often imagined infractions. Some victims were murdered because he suspected them of being pedophiles, based on flimsy evidence or mere rumor. Others were killed simply because he disliked obese people, drug users, or gay people. Most of the victims were friends or acquaintances of at least one member of the group. Some were family members, occasionally living in the same house as one of the killers. Others were befriended briefly, and then pulled into the group as easy targets. A forensic psychiatrist named Kevin Howells, from Broadmoor Hospital in the United Kingdom, believed Bunting's behavior showed a lack of emotion and an inability to empathize with his victims. The profile of a psychopathic killer who derived satisfaction from controlling them. Bunting's victims were forced to address him using titles like, quote, God, Master, Chief Inspector, and Lord Sir. In one of the spare rooms of his house, Bunting had constructed what became known as a rock spider wall, an interconnected web of names, created from paper notes and yarn, of people Bunting alone suspected of being pedophiles or homosexuals. He would select a name from the wall, then call and threaten that person. The group also went to great lengths to access victims' Social Security and bank details, so they or their associates could impersonate the dead and continue collecting pensions or welfare payments after murders. In total, $97,200 was collected this way, although investigators don't believe fraud was the primary motive behind the killings. The final murder of David Johnson took place inside the Snowtown bank building itself, after the barrels containing most of the earlier victims' remains had already been moved there for storage. Let's go through each of the 12 victims. Clinton Douglas Trezise, 20, was bludgeoned to death with a shovel in Bunting's living room in Salisbury after being invited inside for a social visit on the 31st of August, 1992. Bunting accused him of being a pedophile and afterward referred to him as, quote, Happy Pants. His body was found buried 2 years later, on the 16th of August, 1994, in a shallow grave at Lower Light. In 1997, his case even became the subject of 2 episodes of an Australian television program called Australia's Most Wanted. Bunting watched one of those episodes with Vlasakis and his mother and boasted, quote, That's my handiwork, revealing to Vlasakis that he had murdered Trezise and disposed of his body with help from Wagner and a woman named Vanessa Lane. Ray Allen Peter Davies, 26, was an intellectually disabled man who in 1993 had a sexual relationship with Suzanne Allen, Bunting's ex-girlfriend. That relationship ended after Allen's grandsons alleged Davies had made sexual approaches toward them, though the two remained friends, and Davies was living in a caravan parked behind Allen's house just before he vanished. On the 26th of December, 1995, Allen's daughter saw Bunting and Allen cleaning out Davies' caravan. Bunting later told Vlasakis he had killed Davies the day before, describing how Vlasakis' own mother and Bunting's wife had stabbed Davies in the leg, before Wagner strangled him unconscious with jumper cables. According to Vlasakis' later court testimony, Bunting and Wagner then loaded Davies' unconscious body into a car and drove 90 minutes to a residence in the town of Becerra, where they threw him into a bathtub and beat him with the end of a pole, causing his death. His body was found on the 26th of May, 1999, in a grave that had been filled with bricks, soil, and concrete on property Bunting had previously occupied. Suzanne Allen, 47, was found buried at Bunting's Salisbury North House on the 23rd of May, 1999, wrapped in 11 separate plastic bags. Bunting concealed her death and continued collecting her pension, claiming a total of $17,000. He claimed she died of a heart attack, though authorities suspected she was murdered after her relationship with Bunting soured. Charges over her death were eventually dropped due to lack of evidence, after a hung jury. Michelle Gardner, 19, was a transgender woman living with a cousin of Wagner's wife. Bunting referred to her as, quote, the biggest homo. Shortly before her disappearance in September 1997, Wagner became furious after seeing Gardner grab one of his children and cover the child's mouth while playing. Bunting and Wagner took her to Murray Bridge, where they strangled her in a shed, forcing her to stand up each time she collapsed. They then staged a robbery at her home to make it look like she had stolen items to pay for gender-affirming surgery. Her body was kept in a barrel until it was later moved to the Snowtown bank vault, where it was found on the 20th of May, 1999. Her left foot had been cut off, so the barrel's lid could be closed. Vanessa Lane, 42, was Wagner's ex-partner, a transgender woman who had begun a relationship with Wagner when he was just 15. They lived together for 8 years before Bunting entered Wagner's life. Bunting held open disdain for Lane, who had a prior conviction for child sexual abuse, but tolerated her because she kept him informed about local pedophiles. Wagner ended the relationship in 1996, and Lane's next partner, Thomas Trevelyan, moved in with her. She later told her mother and Bunting's ex-girlfriend she had been traumatized after witnessing the killing of Trezise, and when questioned, Bunting confirmed her account was accurate. On the 17th of October, 1997, Bunting, Wagner, and Trevelyan picked Lane up, tortured her for her banking information, even crushing her toe with pliers, before strangling her to death. Bunting then took over her vehicle and claimed her welfare payments. Her dismembered body was found on the 20th of May, 1999, alongside Gardner's. Thomas Eugenio Trevelyan, 18, was Lane's last partner and suffered from paranoid schizophrenia that led him to believe he was a soldier, so he always wore army fatigues. He helped Bunting and Wagner kill Lane, after he later attempted to kill a dog with a knife while it was being played with by a child. Bunting decided he'd become a liability. On the 5th of November, 1997, Bunting and Wagner drove him to Kersbrook in the Adelaide Hills, put a noose over his neck, and left him. He was found hanging from a tree the following day. Given his history of prior suicide attempts, the coroner ruled his death a suicide. Gavin Allen Porter, 29, was Lasakis' friend, diagnosed with schizophrenia and a heroin addict. He moved in with Lasakis after his mother's death. Bunting called him a, quote, waste, after being pricked by a syringe Porter had left on his couch. Bunting decided Porter would be his next victim. He was sleeping in his car on Bunting's property when he was attacked. He managed to stab Bunting in the hand with a screwdriver before being overpowered and strangled. His body was found on the 20th of May, 1999. Troy Yud, 21, was Lasakis' half-brother, whom Lasakis had confided to Bunting had sexually abused him at age 13. Bunting and Wagner woke Lasakis to tell him they planned to kill Yud. They beat him in his bed, then dragged him to the bathroom for further torture, using pliers on his toes to force him to recite banking information. He was strangled to death. His body was found on the 20th of May, 1999. Frederick Robert Brooks, 18, was the son of Jody Elliott. Bunting became fixated on the belief he was, quote, touching up young girls. In September 1998, Brooks was invited to a party after being accepted into the Australian Air Force Cadets. He was tortured in a bathtub, with lit cigarettes inserted into his ears and nostrils, a lit sparkler inserted into his urethra, and bleach injected into his testicles, which were wired to an electrical device. His toes were crushed before he choked to death on a gag. His body was found on the 20th of May, 1999. Gary O'Dwyer, 29, was Bunting's neighbor, both mentally and physically disabled. Bunting called him a slur and had Lasakis learn details about his finances and family situation. Lasakis arranged for O'Dwyer to have drinks with, quote, a couple of friends, who were actually Bunting, Wagner, and Lasakis. After getting him drunk, Wagner grabbed him by the throat and tortured him for several hours. His body was taken to Hayden's home before being found in the Snowtown bank vault on the 20th of May, 1999. Elizabeth Hayden, 37, was Mark Hayden's wife and Frederick Brooks's aunt. Bunting was informed by her husband that he had told her about the murders. Both Bunting and Wagner had grown to detest her. On the 21st of November, 1998, while her husband and children were out, Bunting and Wagner arrived at her home, dragged her to the bathroom, tortured her, and killed her, leaving a rope around her neck and a gag taped into her mouth. Purportedly, when her husband was later shown her remains, he laughed. Her body was found in the bank vault on the 20th of May, 1999. David Johnson, 24, was Lasakis' stepbrother. Bunting disliked him for being fastidious about his cleanliness and appearance, calling him derogatory names. Bunting suggested Vlasakis find a way to lure him to Snowtown. On the 9th of May, 1999, Vlasakis told Johnson there was a cheap computer for sale there, and he agreed to come along. He was overpowered as soon as he entered the bank building. He was the only victim who died in Snowtown, and his body was found on the 20th of May, 1999. In one of the most disturbing details of this entire case, a piece of flesh from Johnson's body was fried and eaten by Bunting and Wagner. The investigation into these murders began somewhat accidentally. Clinton Treziz's body had been found at Lower Light in 1994, but no connection to Bunting was made at the time. Similarly, Thomas Trevelyan's 1997 death was initially treated as a suicide. It was ultimately police inquiries into Elizabeth Hayden's disappearance that led investigators to Snowtown, and in May 1999, the remains of 8 victims were found by South Australian police inside 6 plastic barrels in a disused bank vault, which is how the case earned its grim nickname. Investigators believe the bodies have been kept in several locations across South Australia before being moved to Snowtown in 1999, likely because the killers had become aware of the ongoing police investigation. 2 more bodies were found buried in the backyard of Bunting's Adelaide house. Police arrested and charged Bunting, Wagner, and Mark Hayden on the 21st of May, 1999. Vlasakis was arrested 5 days later, on the 26th of May, while still living in Bunting's home. The trial of Bunting and Wagner lasted almost 12 months, the longest trial in the history of South Australia. One juror withdrew in October 2002 due to the graphic nature of the evidence. In September 2003, Bunting was convicted of committing 11 murders, and Wagner 10, 3 of which he had confessed to. Vlasakis pleaded guilty to 4 of the murders. In 2004, Hayden was convicted on 5 counts of assisting with the murders, admitting to 2 of them. The jury couldn't reach a decision on 2 further murder charges against Hayden, along with another assisting murder charge, and prosecutors indicated they would seek a retrial. The final remaining charge against Bunting and Wagner, relating to Susan Allen's death, was dropped on the 7th of May, 2007, after a jury was unable to reach a verdict. Justice Brian Ross Martin determined that Bunting was the ringleader and sentenced him to 11 consecutive terms of life imprisonment without any possibility of parole. Wagner received 10 consecutive terms under the same conditions. At his sentencing, Wagner declared from the dock that pedophiles had been doing terrible things to children, that the authorities hadn't done anything about it. So he had decided to take action, and he thanked the court. Vlasakis was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences with a non-parole period of 26 years, and Hayden received 25 years with an 18-year non-parole period. More than 250 suppression orders were put in place preventing publication of details from this case. In early 2011, a judge lifted the remaining suppression orders in response to a request from the producers of a film called Snowtown, a dramatization depicting the murders and the events leading up to them. In February 2024, Hayden was granted parole, with authorities citing his excellent behavior in prison, and he was released in April, residing at a pre-release center before leaving it in May 2024. In August 2025, Vlasakis was granted parole after 26 years behind bars, but that decision was overturned on review, meaning he remains in prison. The notoriety of these murders brought a short-term economic boost to Snowtown from curious tourists, but also created a lasting stigma. The Age newspaper reported in 2011 that the town would be forever stigmatized by its association with the case. Shortly after the bodies were discovered, the community discussed renaming the town Rosetown, though nothing ultimately came of it. As of 2012, one shop in Snowtown was even selling souvenirs related to the murders. The house in Salisbury North where Bunting had lived and buried 2 bodies was demolished by its owner, the South Australian Housing Trust. The bank building itself, along with its attached 4-bedroom house, was put up for auction in February 2012, but only reached half its reserve price. It eventually sold later that year for just over $185,000, with new owners intending to live in the house while running a business out of the bank. A plaque was installed to commemorate the victims. Case number 7, Bevan Spencer Von Einem, the family murders. Our 7th case takes us back to Adelaide, South Australia, and introduces us to Bevan Spencer Von Einem, an accountant by profession, who became a convicted child murderer and suspected serial killer. Von Einem was born on the 29th of May, 1946, and died of natural causes in prison on the 5th of December, 2025, at the age of 79. He was convicted in 1984 for the murder of 15-year-old Adelaide teenager Richard Kelvin, the son of a well-known local television and radio personality named Rob Kelvin. Von Einem served a life sentence for that crime. He spent decades in G Block of Yatla Prison before being transferred to Port Augusta Prison in 2007. Beyond the Kelvin case, he was suspected in several other murders, though he was never charged in relation to any of them. Von Einem first came to public attention in May 1972 in an unusual way, as the person who came to the aid of a gay man named Roger James, who had been thrown into the River Torrens during the murder of a man named George Duncan. A group of police officers were suspected in Duncan's death, but nobody was ever charged or convicted. The area was a popular meeting spot for gay men, since homosexual acts were illegal in South Australia at the time. Duncan, a British law lecturer who had only arrived in Australia 7 weeks earlier, drowned because he couldn't swim. Roger James, also thrown into the river, suffered a broken leg but managed to crawl to the roadside, where Von Einem found him and drove him to the Royal Adelaide Hospital. James recovered from his injuries. Now, let's get into the case that ultimately put Von Einem behind bars. Richard Dallas Kelvin was born on the 1st of December, 1967, and murdered by Von Einem around the 10th of July, 1983, after having been abducted, held captive, sexually abused, drugged, and tortured for 5 weeks. He was 15 years old. At approximately 6:15 in the evening on the 5th of June, 1983, Von Einem, likely along with other unknown persons, abducted Kelvin near the intersection of Margaret Street and Pepper Tree Lane in North Adelaide, just 60 meters from Kelvin's own home. He had just seen off a friend at a nearby bus stop after the two of them had spent the afternoon playing football in a local park, and he was expected home immediately for dinner. A security guard living on Margaret Street reported hearing cries for help, car doors slamming, and a car with a noisy exhaust speeding away. Kelvin had a dog collar around his neck at the time, which may have caught Von Einem's attention. Police launched a wide search, and the case attracted extensive media coverage, including a full-page missing person poster in the Advertiser on the 28th of June, which unfortunately included a false lead. A $5,000 reward was offered by the state government 2 days after his disappearance, quickly raised to $15,000 a week later, generating numerous tips and reported sightings. Kelvin's fate remained unknown until his clothed body was found 7 weeks later, on the 24th of July, 1983, by a geologist searching for moss rocks with his family, beside a dirt airstrip near One Tree Hill in the Adelaide Hills, close to where relatives of Von Einem lived. Little effort had been made to conceal the body. He was still wearing his Channel 9 shirt, blue jeans, and white Adidas sneakers on the day he was abducted, along with a dog collar. The autopsy revealed Kelvin had most likely died from massive blood loss caused by an anal injury, probably from the insertion of a blunt object with a tapered neck, such as a beer bottle. He also had bruising and injuries to his head, back, and buttock, as well as a fractured front tooth sustained either just before or just after death. Toxicology found traces of alcohol and 5 different hypnotic drugs in his bloodstream, sold under the trade names Mandrax, Noctec, Amital, Valium, and Rohypnol. Because Mandrax had been regulated by the Central Board of Health back in 1978, its use had declined significantly in Australia. So police began sifting through prescription records. They found a prescription for Mandrax issued to a, quote, B. Von Einem, a name already familiar to them, since he had previously been questioned about the deaths of 3 young men and an alleged sexual assault case. For days after Kelvin's body was found, Von Einem was questioned about the murder. He initially claimed he hadn't seen Kelvin and had no idea of his whereabouts, saying he'd been in bed with the flu on the night of the abduction and off work the following week. Police searched his home in the northern suburb of Paradise, where he lived with his invalid mother, and seized a bottle of Mandrax. He admitted the drugs were his, saying he used them to help him sleep, but denied having any others, though police also found a bottle of Noctec hidden on a ledge behind his wardrobe. Von Einem voluntarily allowed police to collect hair and blood samples, along with carpet fibers and other materials. Forensic investigators matched numerous fibers found on Kelvin's clothing to those from Von Einam's home, along with matching hairs. Forensics also determined Kelvin had been murdered between the 8th and 11th of July, 1983, and dumped at the airstrip no later than the 11th. With mounting evidence placing Kelvin at Von Einam's home around the time of his death, police arrested and charged Von Einam with murder on the 3rd of November, 1983. He continued to deny ever having contact with Kelvin. The committal hearing began on the 20th of February, 1984. Faced with irrefutable evidence that Kelvin had spent time in his company, Von Einam changed his story, admitting he had been in contact with Kelvin on the night of the 5th of June, 1983. He claimed he had been driving along O'Connell Street looking for parking to buy fish and chips, and while searching a side street, nearly ran Kelvin over as the boy jogged past. Von Einam said he believed Kelvin had bisexual tendencies, and that the two had a conversation about problems Kelvin was having at school, after which Kelvin willingly got into the car, and they drove to Von Einam's home together. This new story was meant to explain how fibers from Von Einam's carpet had gotten onto Kelvin's clothes. To explain fibers from his bed, Von Einam claimed the two had sat together and played with a large gold harp he kept in his bedroom. And to explain fibers from his cardigan, he said he'd put his arm around Kelvin to comfort him, since the boy was upset about being bullied at school. Concluding his story, Von Einam said Kelvin had stayed for 2 hours before he dropped him off in the Adelaide CBD near the Royal Adelaide Hospital, giving him $20 for a taxi home. But despite the elaborate detail, Von Einam's new account directly contradicted his original statement, that he'd been homesick with the flu that whole night, and the sheer quantity of fibers on Kelvin's clothing was far too large to be explained by just a 2-hour visit. On the 25th of May, 1984, Magistrate Nick Manos ordered Von Einam to stand trial for Kelvin's murder. The trial opened at the Supreme Court of South Australia on the 15th of October, 1984, before Justice White. A jury of 12, 7 women and 5 men, was selected. Von Einam pleaded not guilty, defended by Barrister Barry Jennings alongside Solicitor Helena Jasinski. The prosecution was led by Brian Martin, who would later become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the Northern Territory, assisted by Paul Rofe, who went on to become the state's Director of Public Prosecutions. The prosecution's case rested on strong scientific evidence gathered during the investigation, along with disproving Von Einam's story about that night. Over the trial's first week, witnesses included Kelvin's parents, girlfriend, and best friend, who testified he was an average 15-year-old who wouldn't have willingly gotten into a stranger's car, that he was heterosexual with no bisexual tendencies, and that the dog collar had only been a joke. Neighbors testified to hearing noises consistent with the abduction happening around 6 that evening. Forensic pathologists described his injuries and likely cause of death, and pharmacists gave evidence of the excessive quantity of drugs prescribed to Von Einam, 5,872 tablets and capsules across 6 different brands between December 1978 and August 1983. Showing it often filled prescriptions at 3 different chemists on the same day. Police officers testified about their investigation, including one who claimed Von Einam's bedroom appeared to have been, quote, extensively cleaned. Forensic scientists were called to establish when Kelvin had died and when his body had been dumped. A leading entomologist, studying the life cycle of insect larvae on the body compared with those on a nearby dead dog, concluded the body had been dumped near the airstrip on the 10th of July, 1983. Other scientists testified about hair and fiber evidence, linking Von Einam to Kelvin. Hairs belonging to Von Einam were found on and inside Kelvin's clothing, and of 925 fiber samples recovered from that clothing, 250 came from Von Einam's home environment, compared with just 7 from Kelvin's own house. The scientists explained that if Von Einam's story were true, there should have been very little or none of this transfer evidence remaining after 36 hours, let alone 5 weeks. The defense tried to counter this by suggesting that after Von Einam's last contact with Kelvin, the boy might have been abducted by other people who stored his clothing for 5 weeks before eventually murdering him and redressing him. While the scientists conceded this was theoretically possible, under further cross-examination, they agreed it was highly unlikely, given how fiber and hair transfer actually works over time. The defense then opted for Von Einam to give an unsworn statement from the dock, rather than testify under oath. In it, he repeated his story about picking up Kelvin, driving him home, and dropping him off in the CBD 2 hours later. He claimed he'd then been sick with the flu for the following week. He was vague about his activities in the weeks after that, though he did remember being at a relative's birthday party on the 10th of July, the day the body was dumped, with his mother, before dropping off a friend and going straight to bed. He also addressed the noisy exhaust reported during the abduction, claiming his own car's exhaust was less than 2 years old and in good condition. He closed by again asserting his innocence. The defense called witnesses to try to corroborate his story, including colleagues who confirmed he'd been unwell during the first week of Kelvin's captivity, the bushwalker who had discovered Kelvin's body, the buyer of von Einem's car, who described his condition, and the relative who hosted the birthday party, who said von Einem and his mother had arrived at 5:30 and left at 10:30 that evening, with photographs from the party tendered as evidence. Finally, von Einem's mother testified about his activities that weekend, but under cross-examination, the prosecution revealed inconsistencies between her current testimony and her earlier statements to police, considerably weakening the defense's case, especially given von Einem's own change of story back in February. In closing, the prosecution argued that the evidence proved von Einem's account was full of lies and inconsistencies, and that he had murdered Kelvin, likely with the help of others. They pointed to his admission of picking Kelvin up, the fiber and hair evidence proving contact around time of death, and the drugs in Kelvin's system proving he'd been held somewhere between those times. They also addressed the timing question by suggesting von Einem could have dumped the body very late on the 10th or in the early hours of the 11th before heading to work. The defense argued the prosecution had failed to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt and hadn't even established the exact cause of death, so the jury should give von Einem the benefit of the doubt. After Justice White's summation, the jury retired on the afternoon of the 5th of November, 1984, after 7.5 hours of deliberation. And amid cheers and applause from a packed public gallery, von Einem was found guilty of Kelvin's murder and sentenced to life at Yatla Labor Prison with 24-year non-parole period. Justice White remarked that the horrendous nature of the crime had added a new dimension to murder in the state, and that he had no doubt von Einem had been party to a cruel, bizarre, and long-standing imprisonment carried out by sexual deviants. The Attorney General of South Australia immediately appealed the leniency of the non-parole period, and on the 29th of March, 1985, the Court of Criminal Appeal increased it to 36 years, a record at the time for the state. This meant von Einem's earliest possible parole date would be the 31st of October, 2007, accounting for time reductions for good behavior. Then Chief Justice Len King, in refusing to reduce the period, said the enormity and depravity of the crime demanded it. Von Einem's defense team appealed the conviction itself, requesting a new trial, arguing about the handling of evidence relating to Kelvin's heterosexuality, references to von Einem's own homosexuality and its potential impact on the jury, and the fact that Justice White's summation hadn't mentioned testimony about the birthday party. The Court of Criminal Appeal rejected the appeal, ruling the trial had been conducted fairly, though they conceded the birthday party evidence should have been included in the judge's summation. Beyond the Kelvin case, von Einem became the leading suspect in the unsolved murders of 4 other young men between 1979 and 1982. Alan Barnes in June 1979, Neil Muir in August 1979, Peter Stogneff in August 1981, and Mark Langley in February 1982, all of whom had suffered similar anal injuries to those found on Kelvin. In February 1988, South Australia State Coroner Kevin Ahern ordered an inquest into these 4 deaths, and on the 24th of March, 1988, found the manner and circumstances of these murders very similar to Kelvin's case, particularly regarding Barnes and Langley. The reward for information was set at $250,000 in 1988, later raised to $500,000 in September 1989, and by 2020 stood at $1 million. Police focused on building a case against von Einem for the murders of Barnes and Langley specifically, since both had been drugged before their deaths, drawing a clear connection to the already prosecuted Kelvin case. The prosecution's case relied heavily on evidence from an informant known only as Mr. B, who claimed he had been in the company of Barnes and von Einem just before Barnes's murder. Mr. B also made startling allegations that von Einem had been involved in the unexplained Beaumont children disappearance of 1966, as well as the disappearance of 2 girls at the Adelaide Oval in 1973. However, none of these allegations could ultimately be corroborated. Police were unable to substantiate much of what Mr. B claimed, particularly given his apparent willingness to implicate von Einem in especially heinous crimes without providing significant detail. On the advice of the Attorney General, the prosecution eventually entered a formal decision not to proceed with the murder charge, and the murders of Barnes, Muir, Stogneff, and Langley remain unresolved to this day. There were several further developments over the following 2 decades. In January 2006, the ABC reported von Einem was under investigation for allegedly raping an inmate multiple times at Yatlow Labor Prison. In October 2006, it was reported he'd been selling hand-painted greeting cards to prison officers for $20 each. In February 2007, he was formally charged over these commercial dealings. In June 2007, he was charged with producing and possessing child pornography after police alleged he had handwritten 3 fictitious stories describing sexual acts between a child and a man. His lawyer believed handwriting analysis would clear him. In July 2007, he was transferred from Yatlow's Maximum Security B Division to Port Augusta Prison. In August 2007, detectives sought public help identifying a young man seen in old news footage of police searching a stormwater drain in the days following the Beaumont children's disappearance. The man bore striking resemblance to a youthful von Einem, and days later it was reported that another man standing beside him in the footage matched the police sketch of a suspect seen with the Beaumont children on the day they vanished. In November 2007, after 24 years behind bars, von Einem became eligible to apply for parole, though then-Premier Mike Rand vowed to enforce new legislation ensuring he would never leave prison alive. In March 2008, it was determined that the child pornography material found in von Einem's cell hadn't actually been written by him, with fingerprints failing to match. His lawyer expected the most serious charge to be dropped. It was also reported that von Einem had been excused from attending his court hearings so he could avoid an unpleasant 3-hour drive alongside other inmates. In April 2008, detectives launched a new investigation into the family murders, interviewing and DNA testing associates of von Einem. In June 2009, he was sentenced to an extra 3 months in jail for possessing child pornography in his cell, though a Supreme Court judge later declined to extend his non-parole term over that offense. In September 2019, crime author Debbie Marshall interviewed von Einem at Port Augusta Prison. Despite decade behind bars, he still denied being a killer, though he admitted to picking up hitchhikers, insisting he never harmed them. In September 2021, Marshall interviewed him again, and later reported that upon being questioned about Kelvin's murder, quote, a psychopath came out. On the 25th of November, 2025, the ABC reported that von Einem had been rushed from Port Augusta to the infirmary at Yatlow Labor Prison, in serious condition, with only a short time left to live. Major crime detectives reportedly visited him at his deathbed. His death at the age of 79 was announced on the 6th of December, 2025. Case number 8, Brett Peter Cowan. The murder of Daniel Morcombe. Our 8th case is one that gripped the entire nation for the better part of a decade, and involves what became the highest profile crime case in Queensland history. This is the story of Brett Peter Cowan. Cowan was born on the 18th of September, 1969, in Bunbury, Western Australia, to Marlene, a homemaker who also worked for the RSL, and Peter Cowan, an Australian Army major and Vietnam veteran. He was the third of 4 boys. The household was strict, with a Catholic upbringing, and was, by many accounts, a good family, though Cowan's father was often absent due to his Army responsibilities and suffered from post-traumatic stress. In the early 1970s, the family relocated to Brisbane, eventually settling in the suburb of Everton Park. Cowan and his 3 brothers attended Marcelin College, an independent Catholic high school. His Year 9 English teacher described him as something of a bully who taunted other students, someone who would proudly parade around with erections, and who was despised by his peers. Other students, though, remembered him simply as an ordinary guy with few hobbies who seemed all right. Cowan dropped out of school in Year 10 and worked odd jobs through his late teens, never holding a position for more than a few months. He also struggled with his bisexuality. He was described by his mother as a handful as a child, growing into a difficult teenager who occasionally stole from her. His problems escalated into petty crime, with his first conviction coming at 17. By that time, He was regularly using LSD, cocaine, and methamphetamines, later stating that drug use, quote, fucked up his inhibitions and boundaries. He had also been part of the Boys Brigade. Cowan's earlier criminal history had led to him performing community service at a public park in Brisbane. On the 5th of December, 1987, during one of these sessions, when Cowan was 18, he took a 7-year-old child from the park into a toilet cubicle and raped him. His demeanor afterward was disturbingly casual. He went and watched television at the child care center where he'd been doing maintenance work. He was sentenced to 2 years in jail in 1989, but served only half of that. In September 1993, while living at a Darwin caravan park with his 18-year-old girlfriend, Tracy Hannaveld, Cowan lured a 6-year-old boy into an abandoned car yard and raped him. The boy was left in an abandoned car in the bush, suffering a punctured lung from the force of the assault, along with several cuts. He managed to stumble to a petrol station, dazed and distraught, and police were called immediately, initially assuming he'd been hit by a car given the severity of his injuries. Cowan denied involvement at first, even telling officers he hoped they caught, quote, the bastard. But police quickly discovered he was the only man at the caravan park who hadn't voluntarily given a DNA sample after semen was found on the boy's discarded underwear. A background check also revealed his 1987 molestation conviction. When confronted with this evidence, Cowan quickly confessed. In 1994, he was sentenced in the Northern Territory Supreme Court to 7 years for grievous harm, deprivation of liberty, and gross indecency, though more serious charges, including attempted murder, had been dropped before trial. He ultimately only served 3.5 years. A psychological assessment described him as a pathological liar living a, quote, parasitic existence, relying mostly on his parents for support with a gross lack of awareness. He apparently believed his victim wouldn't report the assault because he, quote, probably enjoyed the experience. Tracy Hannaveld confronted Cowan in prison and asked if he'd been involved. His silence made his guilt clear to her, and she left distraught. It was the last contact she ever had with him. In March 2014, prior to his sentencing in the Moorhouse case, Hannaveld spoke publicly about their relationship, describing it as marked by infidelity on his part. During his trial for the Moorhouse case, Cowan told the sentencing judge that his, quote, years of heavy poly drug use explained his history of assault. Following his release in 1997, Cowan expressed a desire for rehabilitation, acknowledging his sexual deviancy as a problem. He was ordered into a sexual offenders treatment program and moved in with his pastor and an uncle, Jenny and Keith Philbrook, on the Sunshine Coast, becoming a reformed Christian. His uncle later described how Cowan's behavior deteriorated once he had his own vehicle, staying out late, going out at unusual hours, using excuses about catching up with mates or fishing, eventually leading to a strained relationship and Cowan moving out into his own flat. In 1998, 29-year-old Cowan moved to the suburb of Beerva with Tracy Lee Moncrief, another churchgoer. They married the following year and had 2 children. Cowan regularly attended church, and no criminal convictions were reported during this period up until 2003. That year, he stopped attending church, and the couple divorced in 2004. He had also signed up to a number of gay dating websites, including Gaydar and Manhunt, using one of these accounts from Perth just before his arrest under a fake name. A newspaper discovered his profile under the alias, quote, Shadow Nunya Hunter, showing he sought out a long list of extreme sex acts and was willing to meet anyone up to roughly 50 years old. Now, let's turn to the case that made Cowan a household name for all the wrong reasons. On the 7th of December, 2003, 13-year-old schoolboy Daniel Moorcombe left his home planning to catch the 1:35 p.m. bus to the Sunshine Plaza shopping center for a haircut and to buy Christmas presents for his family. He never returned. A bus had broken down on the side of the road, and a replacement bus was sent to collect the waiting passengers. That replacement bus drove past Daniel, and within a 3-minute window afterward, Cowan is believed to have abducted him. At the time, Cowan was living in the town of Beerva, near where Daniel disappeared, and was approached by police early on due to his criminal history and proximity to the area. Just days after the disappearance, he denied any involvement. A former police officer, though, believed him to be a suspect from just one encounter, saying he left with a distinct impression of guilt. A police interview conducted in July 2005 saw Detective Tracy Barnes ask Cowan directly if he'd admit involvement. He responded, quote, "Probably not." Over the following years, attention shifted to another convicted sex offender, Douglas Jackway, after witnesses reported seeing a blue vehicle near the abduction site that closely matched the car Jackway owned. Cowan was nonetheless brought before the Daniel Moorcombe coroner's inquest 6 years later, referred to only as P7. He claimed he had driven along the road where Moorcombe disappeared, but only to pick up a mulcher, providing this as an alibi. He also said he'd visited his cannabis dealer during the relevant window of time. But further investigation revealed his dealers hadn't actually been home that day, meaning his alibi couldn't hold. Despite this weak alibi, police still lacked any concrete forensic evidence to charge him. During this period, Cowan legally changed his name to Shadow Nunya Hunter, possibly to evade police attention. He later claimed Shadow had simply been his dog's name, and Nunya a shortened version of the phrase, "none of your business." Moncrief. His wife at the time later admitted in court that she had lied about his whereabouts on the day Moorcombe disappeared, saying she'd been, quote, "blinded by love." After their divorce, she revealed he had actually been gone for up to 5 hours that day. The breakthrough in this case came through a covert police procedure known as Mr. Big, drawn from a method previously used in Canada. It involves undercover officers posing as members of a corrupt criminal organization, gradually gaining a suspect's trust through an escalating series of elaborate fictional crimes, theft, prostitution, drug trafficking, before eventually persuading the suspect to confess to the real crime under investigation. In this case, an undercover officer posing as a crime boss named Paul Fitzsimmons, or Fitzy, befriended Cowan on a flight to Perth in April 2011. Over the following months, Cowan's new gang of friends drew him into an array of fake criminal scenarios. Around this time, he was issued a subpoena regarding his alibi in the Moorcombe case, and he continued to deny any involvement. In August 2011, during an interview at the Perth Hyatt Hotel, an undercover officer gained his trust by insisting he only wanted to help, that Cowan could trust him with anything. Cowan then disclosed his involvement in Moorcombe's abduction, and the confession was captured on video. Over the following days, Cowan led the undercover officers to the site where Moorcombe's remains were located. Once there, several undercover police officers moved in and arrested him. On the 13th of August, 2011, Cowan was taken into custody and charged with Moorcombe's murder, along with other offenses including child stealing, deprivation of liberty, indecent treatment of a child under 16, and interfering with corpse. Around this time, a white Mitsubishi Pajero was seized from a property on Russell Island, believed to have been used in the abduction after a witness at the 2011 coroner's inquest reported seeing a similar vehicle parked 100 meters north of where Moorcombe was last seen. On the 7th of February, 2013, Cowan was ordered to stand trial, charged with murder, indecently dealing with child under 16, and improperly interfering with a corpse. The trial began on the 10th of February, 2014, at the Supreme Court of Queensland in Brisbane, before Justice Rosalind Atkinson. Cowan claimed he had only confessed because of the lucrative money deal offered him by the fake criminal gang, and the undercover officer posing as, quote, Arnold, later agreed that the crime gang had dangled the prospect of big money in front of him. The prosecution closed its case on the 7th of March, having called 116 witnesses and tendered more than 200 exhibits. Cowan pleaded not guilty and declined to give evidence himself. Daniel's parents, Bruce and Denise Moorcombe, along with his brothers, gave lengthy victim impact statements. Cowan expressed no remorse. On the 13th of March, 2014, Cowan was found guilty on all charges. The following day, the 14th of March, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 20 years, along with 3.5 years for indecently dealing with Moorcombe and 2 years for interfering with his corpse, both served concurrently. Judge Rosalind Atkinson told him she didn't believe he should be released after 20 years, a statement that could yet affect how long he ultimately serves. In August 2016, while incarcerated at Woolston Correctional Center, Cowan was assaulted by another inmate, Adam Paul Davidson, who was found guilty of pouring boiling water over him from a mop bucket before striking him. Davidson received a 3-year sentence for that attack. Cowan has undergone multiple psychiatric examinations dating back to his earliest offenses in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The psychologist who assessed him after his second molestation conviction in 1993 described him as a pathological liar with mild psychopathic features, indicating a severe lack of empathy. Despite this, no firm psychiatric diagnosis was ever pinned down. Those who knew him, particularly ex-girlfriends, describe him as initially charming, confident, and handsome, qualities that made it easy for him to earn his victims' trust. The trial judge herself remarked that Cowan didn't look like a monster or a pedophile, that he looked like an ordinary person, while also noting he was a convincing and adaptable liar. In a 2007 psychologist report, Cowan said he always worried that if things got bad, he could offend again, though he believed he could never do so against his own flesh and blood. His reputation as a seemingly ordinary, everyday individual became a particular focus of media coverage throughout the investigation and his eventual trial. Case number 9, Derek Percy, the unsolved suspect. Our 9th case is unusual because it centers on a man convicted of just one murder, yet suspected, though never charged, in connection with some of Australia's most infamous unsolved child disappearances. This is the story of Derek Ernest Percy. Percy was born on the 15th of September, 1948, in Strathfield, New South Wales, the eldest of 4 sons born to Ernest and Elaine Percy. His father, a sailing enthusiast, had worked as a New South Wales railway electrician before taking a job with the State Electricity Commission in Victoria. The family moved frequently to Chelsea in 1954, then Warrnambool in 1957 and Mount Beauty near Bright in 1961. Percy began attracting the attention of authorities in late 1964, when he started stealing and wearing female underwear and dresses and mutilating dolls with knives and razor blades. In 1965, the family relocated once again, this time to Cairncoban in New South Wales, their 6th move in 12 years, where Percy began writing down bizarre and violent sexual fantasies. In 1966, he repeated year 11, then attempted year 12, before dropping out of school and joining the Australian Navy as a naval rating in electrical mechanics in November 1967. He was posted to the aircraft carrier HMAS Melbourne in March 1968, the troop ship HMAS Sydney on the 1st of July, 1968, and the HMAS Cerberus Naval Base in April 1969. Percy was arrested at Cerberus, near Crib Point on Victoria's Mornington Peninsula, for the murder of 12-year-old Yvonne Toohey at Ski Beach, near Warneet on Western Port Bay, on the 27th of July, 1969. At the moment he abducted Toohey at knife point, he also attempted to abduct her friend, 11-year-old Shane Spiller, who escaped only by threatening Percy with his own tomahawk. Spiller was unable to describe both his abductor and his vehicle to police, an orange Datsun station wagon with a Navy sticker on the back window and bumper. Police, accompanied by Spiller, went to Cerberus and found Percy machine-washing blood off his clothes. When questioned, he denied any involvement, but eventually led police to Toohey's mutilated body in a paddock on Fisheries Road at Devon Meadows, about 8 kilometers from where she'd been taken. Police also found Percy's personal journals, describing and illustrating disturbing sexual fetishes, including coprophilia, urophilia, and cannibalism. In 1970, he was found not guilty of the murder by reason of insanity and remanded indefinitely. Percy repeatedly stated he couldn't remember whether or not he committed any further crimes. Detectives began piecing together his movements around the country at the time of several unsolved murders. They noted that the Percy family had often taken caravan holidays timed with yachting regattas near beaches, the same kind of locations where most of the unsolved crimes had taken place, and that his naval postings had repeatedly brought him close to many of the crime scenes, all while he was known to harbor pedophilic and psychopathic fantasies toward children. In 2007, a cache of 35 boxes of Percy's diaries, drawings, maps, and newspaper clippings was discovered in a storage unit in South Melbourne, casting even further suspicion on him. Because of the nature of the Toohey attack and documents found in his possession, Percy became a suspect in several other unsolved cases. In the Wanda Beach case, from the 11th of January, 1965, Percy was known to have been visiting his friend's grandparents in Ryde at the time, in a house near the homes of the victims. Witnesses, based on identical images, recalled seeing a young man resembling Percy talking with 2 girls on a train and at Wanda Beach, and he was considered a leading suspect by police for those murders. In the Beaumont case, from the 26th of January, 1966, Percy admitted to being at Glenelg Beach in Adelaide on a family trip the very day the Beaumont children disappeared, though he denied any involvement. In the Alan Redston case, from the 28th of September, 1966, Canberra police issued a description of a fair, thin-faced teenager they wanted to interview, along with an identikit image that closely resembled Percy. He later told police he had been in the capital at the time, but claimed he couldn't remember any further details. In the Simon Brook case, from the 18th of May, 1968, Percy had been stationed at the Cockatoo Dry Dock on Sydney Harbor, and an identikit of the suspect who killed and mutilated the 3-year-old boy closely resembled the earlier Redston suspect image. A new inquest was held in 2005 naming Percy as the prime suspect, but it stalled due to a lack of evidence. And in the Linda Stillwell case from the 10th of August 1968, Percy was formally ruled, in October 2014, a year after his death, to have abducted and killed the 7-year-old girl, who had disappeared while playing at the St. Kilda foreshore in Melbourne. At the time, Percy had been transferred to Sydney, was on leave, and admitted to having been driving in the area. There was also a case involving the attempted abduction of a 12-year-old girl on the 1st of April, 1969. While she was riding her bicycle near the Cerberus base. The victim later identified Percy following the Toohey incident. Derek Percy died from lung cancer at St. Vincent Hospital in Melbourne on the 23rd of July, 2013, at the age of 64, without ever admitting to any further crimes. At the time of his death, he was the longest-serving prison inmate in Australian history, having spent some 44 years behind bars. Case number 10. David and Catherine Burney, the Moorhouse murders. Our 10th and final case tonight brings us to Perth, Western Australia, and to a husband and wife team whose crimes shocked the nation. David John Burney and Catherine Margaret Burney, born on the 16th of February, 1951, and the 23rd of May, 1951, respectively, murdered 4 women at their home in 1986 and attempted to murder a 5th. The press dubbed these crimes the Moorhouse murders, named after the couple's address, 3 Moorhouse Street, in the Perth suburb of Willagee. Let's start with David Burney's background. He was the oldest of 5 children, growing up in Wattle Grove, a semi-rural suburb of Perth. School friends and church acquaintances remembered his family as dysfunctional, subject to frequent rumors of alcoholism, promiscuity, and incest. The family never ate regular meals together, and his parents didn't cook for their children. In the early 1960s, Burney's parents moved the family to another Perth suburb, where he eventually met Catherine Harrison through mutual friends. At 15, he left school to become an apprentice jockey for a trainer named Eric Parnham at the nearby Ascot racecourse. During his time there, he physically abused the horses and developed a habit of exhibitionism. One night, wearing nothing but stockings over his head, he broke into the room of an elderly woman where he was boarding and attempted to rape her. By his adolescence, Burney had been in and out of prison repeatedly for various misdemeanors and felonies. As an adult, he became addicted to sex and pornography, developing paraphilic tendencies. In his early 20s, he married his first wife and had a daughter, Tanya, who was 10 years old at the time of his arrest. Tanya, who has since changed her surname, never married or had children of her own, saying she didn't want to, quote, spawn another David Burney. By late 1986, at the time of the murders, Burney was working at a car wrecker's shop in Willagee. Now let's look at Catherine Burney's background. She was born Catherine Margaret Harrison on the 23rd of May, 1951. She was just 2 years old when her mother, Doreen, died giving birth to her brother, who himself died 2 days later. Unable to raise her, Catherine's father sent her to live with her maternal grandparents. At age 10, a custody dispute resulted in her father regaining sole custody. Catherine met David when she was 12 and began a romantic relationship with him 2 years later. Her father repeatedly pleaded with her to leave David, since her involvement with him kept getting her into trouble with police, and she was eventually sent to a youth prison as an adolescent. Encouraged by a parole officer, Catherine took a job as a housekeeper for the McLaughlin family. She married Don McLaughlin on her 21st birthday and had 7 children with him, though their firstborn son was killed in infancy after being struck by a car. In 1985, Catherine left her family and reunited with David. The two were never legally married, but Catherine changed her surname to Burney by deed poll. Over a period of just 5 weeks, the Burneys abducted 5 women and girls, aged between 15 and 31. All but one were raped at their Moorhouse Street home and subsequently murdered. The one exception was their final victim, who managed to escape the following day and led police straight back to Burney House, bringing their crime spree to an end. Let's go through their victims. Mary Nielsen, 22, was a psychology student at the University of Western Australia and a part-time deli worker. She met David at the car wrecker's shop where he worked, and he offered to sell her cheap tires, giving her his phone number. When she visited Moorhouse Street on the 6th of October, 1986, she was gagged, chained to a bed, and raped by David while Catherine watched. She was then taken to Gleneagle, near Albany Highway in Bedfordale, raped again, and strangled with a nylon cord. David then stabbed her, believing, as he claimed he'd read somewhere, that it would speed up decomposition. Catherine joined him in burying her in a shallow grave. She would have received her psychology degree from university the following year. 2 weeks later, Susanna Candy, a 15-year-old high school student from Nedlands, was abducted while hitchhiking along Sterling Highway in Claremont. Once inside the couple's car, she was bound and held at knife point. The Burneys forced her to write letters home to reassure her family she was safe, then took her to Moorhouse Street and subjected her to the same ordeal as Nielsen. After an unsuccessful attempt to strangle her with a nylon cord, they forced sleeping pills down her throat. Once the pills took effect, David placed a cord around her neck and told Catherine to prove her devotion to him by killing the girl herself. Catherine complied while David watched. Susanna was buried close to Nielsen's gravesite in Gleneagle. When later asked why she had murdered Candy, Catherine said she wanted to see how strong she was within herself, that she didn't feel a thing, that it was exactly as she'd expected, that she was prepared to follow David to the end of the earth to satisfy his desires, and that females, in her mind, hurt and destroy males. On the 1st of November, 31-year-old Nolene Patterson ran out of fuel on Canning Highway while driving home from her job as bar manager at the Nedlands Golf Club. The Burneys picked her up, and just like the first 2 victims, forcibly took her to Moorhouse Street, where she was repeatedly raped by David. The couple originally planned to murder her that same night, but David kept her prisoner for 3 days, apparently developing an emotional attachment to her. Catherine, growing jealous, gave him an ultimatum: kill Patterson or she would kill herself. David immediately forced an overdose of sleeping pills into Patterson and strangled her while she slept. They buried her at Gleneagle, but away from the other graves. Catherine reportedly took great pleasure in throwing sand onto Patterson's face during the burial. On the 5th of November, the Burneys abducted 21-year-old Denise Brown from a bus stop on Sterling Highway. Like the earlier victims, she was taken at knife point and assaulted at Moorhouse Street. The following afternoon, she was driven to the Wanneroo Pine Plantation, where David raped her in the car while they waited for darkness. After dragging her out, he raped her again and stabbed her in the neck. Believing she was dead, the couple dug a shallow grave and laid her body in it. But Brown sat up in the grave. David then struck her twice in the head with an axe and buried her again. On the 9th of November, 17-year-old Kate Moyer was abducted at knife point after accepting a ride from the couple. David held a knife to her throat and forced her to call her mother. Moyer told her mother she'd had too much to drink and would stay with a friend, hoping her mother would realize this was a lie, since Moyer was a drinker and called to check. She later said she asked the couple whether they planned to kill or rape her, and was told, quote, "We'll only rape you if you're good." She was forced to dance for them and slept in their bed handcuffed to David. After David left for work the following day, Catherine went to answer the front door for a drug deal and forgot to chain Moyer to the bed. Moyer broke the lock on a nearby window and climbed out, hitting her head on the concrete below. After knocking on several neighbors' doors, she jumped a gate and was attacked by David's dog. She managed to run into a nearby vacuum cleaner shop, telling the owner she had been raped. Moyer gave police extensive detail about her ordeal, and while some officers were initially skeptical, 22-year-old Constable Laura Hancock believed her account from the very start given the level of detail she provided, including the Bernies' address and phone number. The Bernies had given Moyer aliases, but she had spotted David's real name on a medicine bottle inside the house. She also told police the couple had watched the film Rocky on video while she was held captive, and described a drawing she'd hidden somewhere in the house as proof she'd actually been there. Police later found both the drawing and the Rocky video cassette in the Bernies' VCR. The couple were arrested, and during questioning, gave conflicting accounts. Catherine denied ever meeting Moyer, while David insisted Moyer had come to their house voluntarily to engage in consensual sex. Detective Sergeant Vince Kadich eventually convinced David to confess and reveal where the earlier victims had been buried. There's also speculation that the Bernies may have been responsible for the disappearance of Cheryl Renwick in May 1986 and Barbara Western in June 1986. It's also been suggested David may have been responsible for the 1980 disappearance of Lisa Marie Mott, though his first wife accounted for his whereabouts that day. That case remains unsolved. When the case went to trial, David pleaded guilty to 4 counts of murder and 1 count each of abduction and rape. When asked why he pleaded guilty, he gestured toward the victims' families and said, quote, "It's the least I could do." He was sentenced to 4 terms of life imprisonment after being found sane enough to stand trial. Catherine was also sentenced to 4 terms of life imprisonment by the Supreme Court of Western Australia. Under the law at the time, both were required to serve a minimum of 20 years before becoming eligible for parole. David was initially held at the maximum security Fremantle prison, but was soon moved into solitary confinement to protect him from other inmates. 3 of the prison's original death row cells were converted for his use, and he remained there until the prison closed in 1991. That cell can still occasionally be viewed today on the True Crime Tour held daily at Fremantle Prison. While incarcerated, David and Catherine exchanged more than 2,600 letters, though they were never permitted any other form of contact. David was found dead in his cell at Casuarina Prison on the 7th of October, 2005, at 4:30 in the morning at the age of 54. An inquest found he had hanged himself using a length of cord attached to an air vent. Several factors were believed to have contributed to his suicide. A failure to provide him with his antidepressant medication had worsened his depression. His computer had recently been confiscated, and he was suspected of sexually assaulting another prisoner. A former prison officer described him, somewhat surprisingly, as a model prisoner who looked after injured animals. Catherine was not permitted to attend his funeral. Catherine remains in prison at Banyup Women's Prison, where she has worked as a prison librarian, and even appeared in a prison production of the musical Nonsense. In 2007, her parole application was rejected, and the state's attorney general at the time, Jim McGinty, said her release was unlikely while he remained in office. Her case was set to be reviewed again in January 2010, but on the 14th of March, 2009, new Attorney General Christian Porter, responding to requests from victims' families, determined she would remain in prison for life. This decision made her the 3rd Australian woman, after Catherine Knight and Patricia Byers, to have her file marked never to be released. Her appeal of that decision was rejected in March 2010. A 4th parole bid was declined in 2016. That same year, surviving victim Kate Moyer launched a campaign to end the Western Australian law that automatically puts convicted killers up for parole review every 3 years, noting that David Bernie himself, before his death, had never even bothered applying for parole. In 2017, Catherine's youngest son, using the alias Peter, publicly called for her execution, stating that being related to her had led to him being assaulted on multiple occasions. He also lent his support to Moyer's campaign to end automatic parole eligibility reviews. And that brings us to the end of tonight's 10 cases, 10 different investigations, spanning decades in every corner of this country, each one a reminder how methodical, how patient, and how thorough Australian police forces have had to become in the pursuit of justice. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next On.